The fire didn't just destroy Mei Lin Zhao's barn, it shattered the last thread of trust she had in this brutal frontier. Standing in the ashes at dawn, she stared at the one man who'd been watching her for 3 years, the cowboy everyone whispered about, and made her accusation clear. You did this. Rhett Mercer had spent 1,000 silent nights protecting her, fixing what broke, driving away threats she never saw coming. And now, the woman he loved believed he was her enemy. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story of betrayal, redemption, and impossible love can reach. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The wind across Blackthorn Ridge carried the smell of sage and dust, the kind of scent that settled into a man's clothes and never quite washed out. Rhett Mercer stood at the edge of the valley, boot propped against the split-rail fence, watching the Zhao ranch through the amber light of late afternoon. 3 years he'd been watching. 3 years of riding the perimeter when the moon was high, mending fence posts before sunrise, chasing off drifters who got too curious about a woman living alone on valuable land. She didn't know. That was the point. Mei Lin Zhao moved through her father's ranch like she was carved from the same granite as the mountains, graceful, unyielding, and utterly alone. Even from this distance, Rhett could see the way she carried herself, chin lifted despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. The weight of grief. The weight of a community that had never wanted her father here, and wanted her even less now that he was gone. Rhett pulled his hat lower, the brim casting shadow across eyes the color of winter sky. He'd learned to keep his distance, learned that his help had to remain invisible. The few times he'd tried to approach directly, she'd met him with suspicion sharp enough to draw blood. "You're the Mercer boy," she'd said the first time, standing in her doorway with a Winchester cradled in her arms, like it was an extension of her body. "I know what people say about your family, about what your father did before he left this valley." She hadn't been wrong to be wary. The Mercer name carried its own kind of weight in Blackthorn. Thorn Ridge, the heavy kind that dragged a man down no matter how hard he tried to rise above it. His father had been a drunk and a cheat, run out of town when Rhett was barely old enough to remember. His mother had raised him alone, working herself into an early grave trying to make people forget the shame. Rhett had spent his whole life trying to be different, trying to be the kind of man worth trusting. But trust was a luxury in this valley, especially for outsiders. And despite being born here, despite bleeding into this soil for 28 years, Rhett Mercer would always be an outsider, just like Mei Lin. Maybe that's why he'd noticed her in the first place, 3 years back, when her father was still alive and the Zhao ranch was thriving under old Chen Zhao's careful hand. The Chinese immigrant had built something remarkable here, a cattle operation that rivaled the biggest spreads in the territory, water rights that made other ranchers green with envy, and a reputation for fair dealing that even the most prejudiced couldn't quite deny. Chen had been different from his daughter in temperament, warm where she was guarded, quick to laugh where she held silence. But they'd shared the same steel core, the same refusal to bend under pressure that didn't come from righteousness, but from something deeper. Survival. Dignity. The bone-deep knowledge that bending meant breaking, and breaking meant losing everything. Rhett had respected Chen Zhao, had bought cattle from him, shared coffee in his kitchen, listened to stories about the old country that painted pictures of mountains that touched heaven and rivers that ran jade green. Chen had never asked about the Mercer name, never treated Rhett like he carried his father's sins on his back. "A man makes his own path," Chen had said once, pouring whiskey into chipped cups. "The son is not the father. In my country, we understand this. Here," he gestured at the window, at the valley beyond. "Here, people forget too slowly and forgive even slower." 2 months later, Chen Zhao was dead. Heart attack, the doctor said. Happened while he was checking the north fence line, alone like he preferred. His horse had come back to the barn without him, reins trailing in the dust. They'd found Chen slumped against a fence post, face peaceful, like he'd just decided to rest his eyes for a moment. Mei Lin had buried her father on the ridge overlooking the ranch, under a pine tree that caught the first light of morning. She hadn't cried at the funeral, at least not where anyone could see. But Rhett had watched her from the back of the small gathering, had seen the way her hands trembled when she threw the first handful of earth onto the coffin, had recognized the particular kind of grief that came from losing the only person in the world who truly understood you. After that, everything changed. The neighbors who'd tolerated Chen because he was useful, because he had connections and money and influence, suddenly remembered that his daughter was young and foreign and female. The tolerance evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Whispers started about whether a woman could really run a ranch alone, about whether those water rights should belong to someone who understood their value, about whether it was appropriate for a Chinese girl to own so much good American land. Rhett heard the whispers in town, in the feed store, and the saloon, in the church vestibule after Sunday services he rarely attended. He heard them and felt something dark and angry coil in his chest, something that made his hands curl into fists and his jaw clench tight. But he said nothing, because speaking up would only make things worse for her. So instead he watched. He watched when fence posts mysteriously fell in the north pasture, and he rode out at midnight to fix them before her cattle could scatter. He watched when the lock on her grain shed was broken, and he replaced it with one twice as strong, leaving the new key wedged in her barn door where she'd find it without question. He watched when drifters camped too close to her property line, and he made sure they understood that moving along was in their best interest. He became a ghost, a shadow, a silent guardian she never asked for and didn't want. And he told himself it was enough. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Rhett straightened, preparing to ride the long way back to his own small spread on the far side of the valley when he saw the smoke. At first, it was just a thin gray ribbon rising from behind the barn. Easy to mistake for cookfire smoke, except it was coming from the wrong direction and growing thicker by the second. Rhett's breath caught in his throat. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, spurring his horse down the slope toward the Zhao Ranch, toward the smoke that was now billowing black and ugly against the darkening sky. The barn. Her barn was on fire. He could see it clearly as he thundered across the valley floor, flames licking up the weathered woodsides, consuming 3 years of stored hay in a roaring conflagration that lit up the evening like a false dawn. His horse fought the bit, nostrils flaring at the smell of smoke and fear, but Rhett drove her forward, mind racing. The cattle. Were the cattle in the barn? No, he'd seen them in the south pasture earlier. But the horses, she kept 2 horses in stalls at night, and if they were trapped, he was off his mount before she'd fully stopped, hitting the ground running toward the barn, an entrance where flames were already crawling across the doorframe. The heat hit him like a physical wall, stealing the air from his lungs and making his eyes water. Through the smoke, he could hear it, the screaming of terrified horses, the crash of hooves against wood as they fought their confines. "Rhett Mercer, you step back from that barn right now." Mei Lin's voice cut through the roar of the flames. He turned to see her running from the house, her black hair streaming loose from its usual braid, face pale with terror, and something else, suspicion. She had her rifle, and it was pointed at him. "The horses," he said, voice rough from smoke. "Your horses are inside." "I know where my horses are." She moved closer, and in the firelight he could see tears streaming down her face. Whether from smoke or emotion, he couldn't tell. "What are you doing here? What did you do?" The accusation hit harder than the heat. "I saw the smoke from the ridge. I came to help. You were watching me again." It wasn't a question. "You're always watching." "People told me, but I didn't believe it could be this bad. You're obsessed." Another beam collapsed inside the barn with a crash that sent sparks spiraling into the night sky. The horses' screams grew more frantic. "We can talk about this after," Rhett said, already moving toward the barn again. "Those animals will burn if someone doesn't—" "Stay where you are!" The rifle didn't waver. Mei Lin's voice shook, but her hands were steady. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't see what this is? You burned down my barn so you can play hero, so you can make me grateful, make me dependent. You think I—" Rhett stopped, the words dying in his throat as understanding crashed over him. She actually believed it. Believed he was capable of this kind of cruelty. "Mei Lin, I would never—" "Don't." Her finger moved to the trigger. "Don't say my name like you know me. You don't know me. You're just another man who thinks he can take what he wants because I'm alone." A horse's scream pierced the air, high and terrible. Rhett made his decision. If she shot him, she shot him. But he wouldn't stand here and let those animals die while she pointed a gun at the wrong man. He turned and ran straight into the burning barn. The smoke was thick enough to choke on, black and oily, and full of the smell of burning hay and scorching wood. He couldn't see 3 feet in front of his face, couldn't breathe without his lungs seizing up. But he knew this barn, had been in it a dozen times, helping Chen with one thing or another back before the old man died. The stalls were on the left side, 6 of them, though only 2 were usually occupied. He found the first horse more by sound than sight, a gray mare named Silver that Chen had loved like a daughter. She was rearing and plunging in her stall, eyes rolling white with terror. The wood of the stall door was already hot to the touch, but the latch opened easily enough. The mare exploded out the moment she had room, nearly trampling him in her panic to escape. He let her go, knowing she'd find her own way out, and stumbled deeper into the smoke. The second horse was worse. The bay gelding had somehow gotten his halter caught on a broken board, and he was pulling against it hard enough to choke himself, hard enough that blood was running down his face from where the leather cut into skin. Rhett's eyes streamed tears, his lungs burning as badly as the barn around him. He couldn't see, could barely breathe, but he got his knife out and started sawing at the leather, whispering things he hoped sounded calming, even though he couldn't hear his own voice over the roar of the flames. The halter parted. The gelding lurched backward, free but disoriented. A beam crashed down 10 feet away, sending up a shower of sparks and cutting off the path back to the main entrance. The heat was unbearable now, turning the air itself into something that seared his throat and lungs with every breath. The gelding bolted in the wrong direction, deeper into the barn. Rhett tried to follow, tried to turn him back, but the smoke was too thick and his vision was narrowing to a tunnel, blackness creeping in at the edges. His legs felt wrong, disconnected from his body. He stumbled, went to one knee, felt the heat of the floor burning through his jeans. This was it then. This was how it ended. Burned alive in a barn, accused by the woman he loved, dying for horses that would probably find their own way out anyway. His father would have found that funny. Hand seized his collar, yanking him backward with surprising strength. He tried to fight, confused, thinking it was the gelding somehow. But then he heard her voice. Mei Lin's voice, sharp and commanding even through the smoke. "Move! Get up and move or we both die here!" She was pulling him toward light, toward air, toward the side of the barn where the flames hadn't quite reached yet. He got his feet under him, stopped being dead weight, and together they crashed through the weakened wall boards and out into the clean night air. They collapsed in the dirt 20 feet from the barn, both coughing hard enough to retch. Rhett rolled onto his side, gasping, watching through watering eyes as both horses circled in the yard, scared but alive. Alive. "You're an idiot," Mei Lin said between coughs. She was on her hands and knees, hair falling around her face, body shaking. "A complete idiot. You could have died." "So could you." He sat up slowly, testing his body for damage. Burns on his hands, on his face probably. His lungs felt like someone had scoured them with steel wool, but nothing broken, nothing that wouldn't heal. "You came in after me." She stopped, seemed to realize she had no good answer for that. "The rifle was empty anyway. I never load it unless I plan to shoot something." Despite everything, despite the pain and the smoke and the dying barn, Rhett laughed. It came out as more of a cough, but it was laughter nonetheless. "You threatened me with an empty rifle. It usually works." She sat back on her heels, face smudged with soot, eyes red from smoke and maybe tears. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the sky, sparks swirling up to meet the first stars. "My father built that barn. It was the first structure he put up when he bought this land." "I know." Rhett had heard the story. Chen clearing the land by hand, cutting timber from the ridge, raising those walls beam by beam with nothing but determination and borrowed tools. "I'm sorry." "Why?" She turned to look at him fully for the first time, really look at him, and there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. Confusion. Suspicion still, but tempered with something else. "Why are you sorry? If you didn't start the fire, what do you have to be sorry for?" "Because you lost something that mattered, and because—" He hesitated, then figured he had nothing left to lose. "Because you thought I could do this to you. Because 3 years of trying to help, and I just made you afraid instead." The barn groaned, a long, slow sound like a dying animal, and then the roof collapsed inward with a crash that sent embers fountaining into the sky. They both watched in silence as the structure that had stood for 15 years was reduced to skeleton and ash. 3 years, Mei Lin said quietly. That's how long you've been watching me. I know how it sounds. Do you? She stood, brushing dirt from her pants with shaking hands. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like obsession. It sounds like the kind of thing that ends with me dead in a ditch somewhere because I rejected the wrong man's attention. I never... Rhett started, but she cut him off with a gesture. You never approached me directly, never made demands, never threatened. Her voice was flat, controlled in a way that was somehow worse than anger. You just watched, fixed things, played ghost, made yourself indispensable without ever asking if I wanted your help in the first place. She was right. He knew she was right, but your north fence was down. The grain shed lock was broken. Those drifters 2 months ago, they were my problems to solve. Mei Lin turned to face him fully, and in the firelight, her face was hard as stone. My land, my responsibility, my choice whether to ask for help or face things alone. You would have lost cattle, lost grain. Those drifters weren't just passing through, Mei Lin. They were... Stop. The word cracked like a whip. Stop saying my name like you have the right. Stop acting like you know what's best for me. Stop thinking your unwanted protection somehow obligates me to be grateful. Rhett felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart. That would be too poetic, too clean. This was messier, uglier, the death of something he'd built in his mind over 3 years, a fantasy where his help mattered, where he was making a difference, where maybe someday she'd understand and things would be different. I loved your father, he said quietly. Chen was kind to me when nobody else in this valley was. When he died and I saw how people started circling, started whispering, I just thought, you thought you'd step in as my protector, my guardian. Mei Lin's laugh was bitter. Did it ever occur to you that I don't need protecting, that I've been taking care of myself my whole life, that maybe the reason people whisper is because they see a strange man constantly watching a woman's property and they wonder what he wants? The words hit like physical blows. Rhett stood slowly, every part of his body aching. I never wanted anything from you. Everyone wants something, Mr. Mercer. She wrapped her arms around herself, and for the first time he saw how young she really was. 25, maybe 26, too young to be carrying all this weight alone. The question is what you're willing to do to get it. And standing in the ashes of my barn, I have to wonder if you finally decided watching wasn't enough. I didn't start this fire. So you say. She looked at the burning wreckage, then back at him. But you were here. You're always here, somehow. Always in the right place at the right time to be the hero. Convenient, isn't it? Rhett felt the accusation settle into his bones like cold. This was what trying to help had bought him. Suspicion, fear, the very thing he'd been trying to protect her from, turned back on himself. I should go, he said. Before someone else shows up and gets the wrong idea. That's the first sensible thing you've said all night. Mei Lin didn't move, didn't look away. And Rhett, don't come back. Don't fix my fences. Don't chase off my problems. Don't watch me from that ridge you think I don't know about. Just leave me alone. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain, wanted to make her understand that everything he'd done came from a place of respect, not obsession. But the look in her eyes stopped him cold. She was afraid, not of the fire, not of the loss, of him. So he left. He rode back across the valley in darkness, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes and skin. Behind him, the glow of the dying barn lit the sky. Ahead, his own small ranch waited. Modest house, modest barn, modest life built on the ruins of his father's mistakes and his mother's sacrifices. He tried to be different, tried to be the kind of man worth trusting, but some stains went too deep to wash out. The next morning, Rhett woke to the sound of horses in his yard. He stumbled out of bed, body aching from smoke inhalation and burns he'd barely treated the night before, and looked out to see Sheriff Tom Brennan standing on his porch. Tom was a good man, fair as frontier law allowed, and he'd known Rhett since childhood. But the expression on his weathered face wasn't friendly. "Tom," Rhett said, opening the door. "This is early, even for you." "Need to talk, Rhett." Officially. Tom's hand rested on his gun belt. Not threatening exactly, but not casual either. Mind if I come in? They sat at Rhett's kitchen table, the same table his mother had scrubbed clean every night. The same table where he'd learned to read and write by candlelight while she mended clothes until her fingers bled. Tom accepted coffee but didn't drink it, just wrapped his hands around the cup like he needed something to hold on to. Zhao barn burned last night, Tom said. I know, I was there. Rhett didn't elaborate. Let Tom ask. That's the thing, Rhett. You're always there. Every time something happens at that ranch, you're somehow involved. Tom finally looked up, eyes tired. Makes people wonder. People always wonder about me. Nothing new there. This is different. Tom set down the cup carefully. I got 3 different folks came to me this morning. Said they've seen you watching that property, riding the perimeter at odd hours. They're saying maybe you're not protecting Mei Lin Zhao. Maybe you're the reason she needs protecting in the first place. The accusation shouldn't have surprised him. After Mei Lin's words last night, he should have been prepared. But hearing it from Tom, hearing it spoken as official suspicion, felt like another crack in that already broken thing inside his chest. I didn't start that fire, Tom. Didn't say you did. But I gotta ask, what were you doing out there? Saw the smoke from my north pasture. Rode over to help. Convenient timing. That's what she said too. Rhett stood, walked to the window. Outside, the valley stretched peaceful and green in morning light, the mountains blue and distant. Beautiful country. Unforgiving country. You know me, Tom. You know my mother raised me better than this. I know your mother was a saint who deserved better than your father gave her. Tom's voice softened. And I know you've spent your whole life trying to make up for his mistakes. But Rhett, this thing with the Zhao woman, it doesn't look good. People are talking. People are always talking. Not like this. Tom stood too, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. Gideon Vale came to see me this morning. He's making noise about the water rights up in the North Valley. Says it's a shame to see good land go to waste because someone doesn't have the resources to work it proper. Rhett's blood went cold. Gideon Vale was the richest man in 3 counties, owned half the territory, and was working on the other half. He was smart, educated back east, and had the kind of connections that could make or break a person with a single telegram. If Gideon was interested in the Zhao ranch, he's circling, Rhett said. He's doing business, Tom corrected. And business is legal, even when it's cold. But here's the thing, he mentioned you specifically. Said people are concerned about your behavior. Said maybe the Zhao woman needs proper protection, not some obsessed cowboy making things worse. I'm not obsessed. Maybe not. But it looks that way, Rhett. And in this valley, looks are all that matter. Tom moved toward the door, settled his hat on his head. I'm not here to arrest you. Not yet. But I'm here to tell you official-like to stay away from that ranch. Whatever you think you're doing to help, you're making things worse, for her and for yourself. After Tom left, Rhett sat alone in his kitchen and tried to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He'd wanted to help, wanted to honor Chen's memory by protecting his daughter, wanted to be the kind of man who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Instead, he'd become exactly what his father had been, a problem people wanted gone. The day passed in a haze. He worked his own land, mended his own fences, tended his own small herd. Normal work, honest work, the kind of thing that should have been enough to build a decent life on. But he couldn't stop thinking about Mei Lin alone at her ranch with no barn, no storage, winter coming, and no shelter for hay or horses. He couldn't stop seeing Gideon Vale's calculating eyes, the way powerful men looked at valuable things they didn't own yet. He couldn't stop hearing the fear in her voice when she'd told him to leave. As the sun set, he saddled his horse one last time and rode to the ridge overlooking her valley. Not close enough to be watching, just close enough to see. The barn was gone, reduced to blackened timber and ash. But in the yard, he could see movement. Mei Lin working in the last light, dragging boards, organizing what could be salvaged. Alone. Always alone. Rhett sat there until full dark, then turned his horse away from the ridge and rode home through the shadows he'd grown so accustomed to living in. She'd asked him to leave her alone. Tom had told him to stay away. The smart thing, the legal thing, the right thing was to respect those boundaries. But in 3 years of watching, Rhett had learned to read this valley, like other men read newspapers. He'd learned the patterns, the way trouble moved, the way danger circled, the way powerful men tested boundaries before they crossed them. And what he'd seen today, Gideon Vale's interest, the sheriff's warning, the whispers turning into something more organized, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. The fire hadn't been an accident, and whoever set it was just getting started. Mei Lin Zhao might not want his help, might hate him for offering it, but Rhett had made a promise to her father, even if Chen had never asked for it. A promise to make sure his daughter had a fighting chance in a valley that didn't want to give her one. So he'd keep his distance like they demanded. He'd stay away from her property like Tom ordered, but he wouldn't stop watching. And when the next disaster came, because in Blackthorn Ridge, disaster always came for people who didn't have protection, he'd be ready. Even if being ready meant losing everything, even if it meant she'd hate him forever. Some promises were worth keeping, no matter the cost. 3 days after the fire, the water stopped flowing. Mei Lin discovered it at dawn when she went to fill the trough for her horses. The creek that ran through her property, the same creek her father had fought for water rights to 15 years ago, the same creek that made this land valuable enough to kill for, was barely a trickle. By midday, it would be completely dry. She stood knee-deep in the creek bed, boots sinking into mud that should have been covered by 2 feet of rushing water, and felt the first real stirring of fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of the barn fire, but something colder and more insidious. The kind of fear that came from understanding that someone was playing a longer game than she'd realized. The cattle would need water by evening. The horses already did. And without the creek, she had nothing. She climbed out of the creek bed and walked upstream, following the dry channel through her property and into the foothills where the water emerged from underground springs. It took an hour of hard hiking, but she found what she was looking for, or rather, what she'd been afraid she'd find. Someone had dammed the creek. It wasn't sophisticated work, just heavy stones and timber wedged into the narrow canyon where the water emerged, redirecting the flow into a side channel that led away from her property entirely. But it was effective, and it was deliberate. Mei Lin stood looking at the dam for a long time, her mind working through possibilities and discarding them one by one. This wasn't random vandalism. This took planning, effort, knowledge of her land and her water sources. This took someone who knew exactly how to hurt her without leaving obvious evidence. She thought about Rhett Mercer immediately, then forced the thought away. Whatever else he might be, he wasn't stupid enough to do something this traceable 3 days after being warned off by the sheriff. And if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be even when honesty hurt, he'd looked genuinely devastated when she'd accused him of starting the fire. But if not Rhett, then who? The answer came to her as she was climbing back down the canyon, and it settled in her stomach like a stone. Gideon Vale. It had to be. The richest man in the territory, the one who'd been making offers on her land since the day after her father's funeral, the one who smiled with too many teeth and called her dear girl, like she was a child playing at ranching instead of a grown woman fighting for her survival. She'd turned down his offers. All of them. Even when they'd been generous, even when continuing alone seemed impossible. Because this land was all she had left of her father, and selling it felt like admitting defeat. Like admitting that people like Gideon Vale were right when they said she didn't belong here. Now, it seemed, he'd decided to stop asking and start taking. By the time Mei Lin made it back to the ranch house, the sun was high and brutal, turning the valley into a furnace. She filled buckets from her well, thank heaven the well still ran deep and clean, and hauled water to the horses until her shoulders screamed and her hands blistered. The cattle would have to be moved to the south pasture where a spring-fed pond still held water, but that was a 2-person job at minimum, and she was achingly, terribly alone. She was considering her options, none of them good, when she heard the horse approaching. For a moment, just a moment, her heart lifted with the irrational hope that it might be Rhett. That despite her words and the sheriff's warnings, he'd come anyway because he somehow knew she needed help. But the horse that crested the ridge was a beautiful chestnut gelding worth more than her entire herd, and the man riding it was Gideon Vale himself. He sat his saddle like a king surveying his kingdom, hat tilted at an angle that suggested he'd practiced the look in a mirror. At 52, Gideon was still handsome in the way that money could maintain, well-fed, well-dressed, skin protected from the worst of the sun by expensive hats and indoor work. He smiled when he saw her, that same too-wide smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Zhao," he called. dismounting with the ease of a man who'd been riding since childhood but never had to break his own horses. "I heard about your troubles. Thought I'd ride out and offer my condolences." "Condolences are for the dead, Mr. Vale." Mei Lin didn't move from the porch, didn't invite him closer. "I'm still very much alive." "Of course, of course." He walked toward her anyway, leading his horse with leather reins that probably cost more than her monthly expenses. "Poor choice of words. I meant to say I'm sorry about your barn. Terrible thing, fire. Unpredictable." "Is it?" She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away first. "Seems to me fire goes exactly where it's directed." Something flickered across Gideon's face. Amusement, maybe, or acknowledgement. "You think someone said it deliberately? That's a serious accusation." I didn't accuse anyone, just observed that fire follows fuel and oxygen, both of which can be controlled by someone who knows what they're doing." "Smart girl." Gideon tied his horse to the porch rail like he owned the place. "Your father was smart too, knew when to fight and when to accept reality. That's why he built such a successful operation here, despite the, shall we say, cultural challenges." Mei Lin felt her jaw tighten. "My father built this ranch through hard work and fair dealing. The only cultural challenge he faced was people who couldn't see past their own prejudice." Now, no need to be defensive." Gideon settled against the porch rail, making himself comfortable. "I admired Chen greatly, but he also knew his limitations, knew there were certain doors that would never open for him in this territory, certain opportunities that required, well, a different face, a different name. What do you want, Mr. Vale?" "Direct. I like that." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "I want to make you an offer, a fair one. More than fair, actually, considering your recent setbacks." "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard my price yet." "Doesn't matter what the price is." Mei Lin crossed her arms, aware that she probably looked like a stubborn child, but not caring. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." Gideon unfolded the paper slowly, making a show of it. $20,000. Cash money, available immediately. Enough to buy a nice house in San Francisco, set yourself up comfortably. Maybe find a husband who doesn't mind. He gestured vaguely at her face, her body. "Well, you know." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, the contempt beneath the polite words. She was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise. "Get off my land," she said quietly. "Miss Zhao, now." She didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made Gideon straighten up. "Take your offer and your condolences and your opinions about what I know, and leave, before I fetch my rifle and make you leave." For a moment, genuine anger flashed across Gideon's face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same practiced smile. "You're making a mistake. This valley isn't kind to people who stand alone. Your father understood that. He made alliances, made compromises. You're too proud for your own good." "My father never compromised his dignity, and neither will I." Gideon mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, settling into the saddle like he had all the time in the world. "I'll give you a week to reconsider. After that, things might get more difficult for you. Ranching is hard work, Miss Zhao. Accidents happen, equipment fails, water runs dry." He let the words hang in the air, not quite a threat, but close enough. "Would be a shame if you lost everything because you were too stubborn to accept help when it was offered." He rode away without waiting for a response, his expensive horse kicking up dust that settled on everything like a promise of worse to come. Mei Lin waited until he was out of sight before she let herself shake. She sank down onto the porch steps, wrapped her arms around her knees, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the fear. 2 minutes to acknowledge that she was 25 years old and alone and facing an enemy with unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. Then she stood up, wiped her eyes, and went back to work. The cattle needed moving. That was the immediate problem, the one she could actually solve. She saddled Silver, the gray mare that Rhett had saved from the barn fire, though she tried not to think about that, and rode out to the south pasture where her herd was scattered across 20 acres of decent grazing land, 43 head of cattle. Not a huge operation by valley standards, but good stock, well-bred, worth enough to keep her afloat if she could get them to market in the fall. Her father had built this herd carefully, selecting breeding stock that could handle the harsh winters and sparse forage of mountain territory. Each animal represented an investment, a gamble on the future. Each one was impossible to move alone. Cattle were herd animals, and moving them required pressure from multiple directions, riders on the flanks to keep stragglers in line, someone at the rear to push the reluctant ones forward, someone in front to lead. One person could do it with a well-trained dog and a lot of patience, but Mei Lin had neither. Her father's old cow dog had died 6 months back, and she hadn't been able to afford a replacement. She tried anyway. For 3 hours, she rode and circled and shouted herself hoarse, trying to push the herd toward the pond in the south pasture. For 3 hours, the cattle scattered and wandered and refused to cooperate, treating her efforts like an annoying but ultimately ignorable interruption to their grazing. By the time the sun started its descent toward the mountains, she'd managed to move maybe a dozen head, and even those looked ready to bolt back to their preferred grazing at the first opportunity. She was considering giving up, letting the herd figure out their own water situation and hoping they had enough sense to find the pond, when she saw the rider approaching from the east. For the second time that day, she thought it might be Rhett. For the second time, she was wrong. The man was a stranger, young and hard-faced, wearing clothes that had seen work but sitting his horse like someone who'd rather be doing anything else. He reined in 20 feet away, not approaching closer without invitation, and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Ma'am," he said, "name's Cole Hendricks. I work for Mr. Vale." Of course he did. Mei Lin felt exhaustion pull at her bones. "If you're here to deliver another message from your boss, you can save your breath. My answer's the same as it was 2 hours ago." "No message, ma'am. Mr. Vale sent me to help." "Help?" She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "How generous of him." "Saw you trying to move your herd. That's hard work for one person." Cole gestured at the scattered cattle. "I've got experience with cattle drives. Could have them to the South Pond in an hour if you'd let me." It was tempting. So tempting that Mei Lin had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from accepting immediately. But she'd learned from her father that gifts from powerful men always came with strings attached, and those strings usually turned into nooses. "Tell Mr. Vale I don't need his help." "Respectfully, ma'am, looks like you do." Cole's voice was carefully neutral, not unkind. "And it's not charity. Mr. Vale pays me wages whether I'm moving his cattle or yours. Won't cost you anything." "Everything costs something, Mr. Hendricks. Your boss wants my land, and helping me keep my herd alive just delays the inevitable." "Why would he do that?" Cole shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "That's between you and him, I suppose. I'm just here to move cattle, if you want them moved." Mei Lin looked at her scattered herd, at the afternoon sun sliding toward evening, at the simple mathematics of the situation. She could accept help from Gideon Vale's man and get her cattle to water before nightfall, or she could cling to her pride and watch them suffer from thirst while she spent another futile 3 hours achieving nothing. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Pride is a luxury, Mei Lin. Sometimes you have to swallow it to survive." "Fine," she said, "but I'm working too. This isn't you doing me a favor. It's 2 people doing a job." "Yes, ma'am." Cole touched his hat again and moved into position on the far flank. Together, they moved the herd in 45 minutes. Cole knew his business, anticipating where the cattle would try to break away and positioning himself to turn them back before they got ideas. Mei Lin found herself grudgingly impressed, despite her determination not to be. Whatever else Gideon Vale was, he hired competent people. The cattle spread out around the pond, drinking deep and settling into the grass with the satisfied sounds of animals whose immediate needs had been met. Mei Lin allowed herself a moment of relief before turning back to Cole. "Thank you," she said, because her father had also taught her that courtesy cost nothing and meant everything. "Tell Mr. Vale." She stopped, unsure what message to send. "Tell him I appreciate the help, but my answer is still no." "I'll tell him." Cole gathered his reins, preparing to leave, then hesitated. "Ma'am, if you don't mind some advice?" "Would it matter if I did?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Probably not, but I'm going to give it anyway. Mr. Vale is used to getting what he wants, and when he doesn't get it through asking nice, he finds other ways. You should consider that." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Cole met her eyes directly. "I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's true. You make your own choices, ma'am, but make them knowing what kind of man you're dealing with." He rode away before she could respond, leaving her alone with her cattle and her thoughts, and the growing certainty that this was all going to get much worse before it got better. The week that followed proved Cole Hendricks right. On Monday, Mei Lin rode into town to buy feed and found that the general store had suddenly run out of everything she needed. "Supply problems," the clerk said, not meeting her eyes. "Should have more in a few weeks." On Tuesday, her fence line was cut in 3 places, letting half her herd wander onto neighboring property. It took her all day to round them up, and the neighbor, a man named Samuel Garrett, who'd been friendly with her father, met her at the property line with a shotgun and a warning that next time he'd consider the cattle abandoned and claim them as his own. On Wednesday, someone poisoned her well. She discovered it when Silver refused to drink, shying away from the trough, with her ears pinned back. Mei Lin drew a bucket of water and found it cloudy, smelling faintly of chemicals she couldn't identify. Testing it with a strip of cloth her father had taught her to use showed contamination, not enough to kill immediately, but enough to sicken anything that drank regularly. The well had been her backup, her insurance against the dammed creek. Now it was useless. She spent that night hauling water from the pond to the house, bucket by painful bucket, knowing it wasn't sustainable, knowing that whoever was doing this was watching her struggle and waiting for her to break. On Thursday morning, Sheriff Brennan rode out to the ranch. He found Mei Lin in the yard, loading buckets onto a makeshift sled she'd rigged to drag behind Silver. She'd been working since before dawn, and exhaustion had settled into her bones like an old friend. "Mei Lin," Tom said, dismounting, "we need to talk. If you're here to arrest me for something, just get it over with." She didn't stop working, didn't look at him. "I've got water to haul and fences to mend and about 1,000 other problems that won't wait for your sense of timing. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because I'm worried about you." Tom moved closer, and his voice gentled. "You look like hell, girl. When's the last time you slept? Ate a proper meal? When's the last time someone didn't sabotage my property?" She finally looked at him, saw him flinch at whatever he saw in her face. "My water's poisoned, Tom. Someone dumped chemicals in my well. That's deliberate. That's criminal. You have proof?" "I have a contaminated well that was cleaned 3 days ago. That's not proof enough?" Tom sighed, and in that sigh, Mei Lin heard everything she needed to know. He wasn't going to help, couldn't help, or wouldn't help, but the result was the same. "I believe someone's making things hard for you," Tom said carefully, "but believing and proving are different animals. Unless you can show me who did it, how they did it, evidence that would hold up if I brought charges." "Gideon Vale," Mei Lin said the name like a curse. "You know it's him. I know it's him. Everyone in this valley knows it's him. Knowing and proving are different animals. Yeah, you said." She went back to loading buckets, shoulders tight with anger. "So what you're telling me is that a rich man can destroy my property, threaten my livelihood, and slowly strangle me out of business, and there's nothing you can do about it. What I'm telling you is that Gideon Vale is a respected businessman with lawyers who could tie up any charges in court for years. What I'm telling you is that unless you have evidence, real evidence, not suspicions, I can't touch him." Tom paused. "But I can offer you some advice. Let me guess. Sell and get out while I still can." "Accept his offer before he stops offering." Tom's voice was tired, resigned. "This isn't about what's fair, Mei Lin. It's about what's real. You can't win this fight, not alone. My father won it. He came here with nothing and built something that lasted 15 years. If he could do it, your father was a man." The words hung in the air, brutal in their honesty. "I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's reality. People made allowances for Chen because he was male and because he had resources and connections. You're a young woman with neither. The rules are different, whether they should be or not." Mei Lin felt something break inside her chest, sharp and painful. Not her spirit. That would take more than honest words to crack. But her last illusion of fairness, of justice, of the idea that hard work and determination were enough. "Get off my property, Tom. Mei Lin, I mean it. You're not here to help me. You're here to make yourself feel better about standing by while a powerful man destroys someone weaker. So get off my land and go back to pretending you're a lawman instead of Gideon Vale's messenger boy." Tom's face went red, then pale. He mounted his horse without another word and rode away, leaving Mei Lin alone with her buckets and her bitterness and the crushing weight of understanding just how alone she really was. That night, she sat on her porch with her father's rifle across her knees and watched the stars wheel overhead. The same stars her father had watched, the same stars that had guided him across an ocean to this harsh land where he'd thought his daughter might build a better life. She'd failed him. That was the truth she couldn't escape. All his sacrifice, all his careful planning, all his hopes for her future. She was letting it slip away because she was too weak, too alone, too foreign to make this valley accept her. The thought of Rhett Mercer crossed her mind unbidden. 3 years he'd watched over her property, fixing problems before they became catastrophes. 3 years of invisible help that she'd spurned and suspected and finally driven away. If he were still watching, would he have noticed the dam? Stopped the well poisoning? Been another pair of hands to move the cattle before dehydration set in? But wanting help from Rhett felt like admitting defeat too. Like confirming every whisper that she needed a man to survive, that she couldn't handle this alone, that the only difference between Gideon Vale's control and Rhett Mercer's protection was which leash she chose to wear. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, someone was shaking her shoulder. She came awake with her hand on the rifle, swinging it up before her eyes were fully open, and found herself staring at Cole Hendricks with his hands raised in surrender. "Easy, ma'am," Cole said quietly. "Didn't mean to startle you, but you need to see something." "What are you doing here?" Mei Lin lowered the rifle but kept it close. "It's the middle of the night." "It's 4 in the morning, which is close enough. And I'm here because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't warn you." Cole's face was grim in the pre-dawn darkness. "There's going to be trouble today. Bad trouble. Mr. Vale's bringing in men from his other properties. Toughs. The kind you hire when you need a problem handled and don't care how." Mei Lin's blood went cold. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where your cattle accidentally get stampeded into the canyon. Where maybe you get in the way trying to stop it and get hurt. Accidents happen on ranches, ma'am. Everyone knows that." "He'd kill me?" She couldn't quite believe it, even knowing what Gideon was capable of. "Overland?" "He'd create a situation where you got killed, which legally is different." Cole's voice was flat, professional. "And yes, overland. You think you're the first person who stood in his way? You're just the first one stubborn enough to make him use the hard methods." "Why are you telling me this? You work for him." "I work for his money, not his methods." Cole shifted, uncomfortable. "My daddy was a ranch hand. Honest man who never got ahead because he didn't have the right name or the right color skin. He taught me that money doesn't make right, and I'm trying real hard to remember that even when my paycheck depends on forgetting it." Mei Lin stood, mind racing. "If this is true, I need to get the cattle moved. Get them somewhere safe before—" "It's too late for that. His men are already positioned in the hills. You try to move the herd now, you'll just trigger what they're planning earlier." Cole paused. "But there might be another way. Someone who might help, if you asked." "Who?" "Rhett Mercer." The name hit her like a physical blow. "No, absolutely not." "Why not? Man's been protecting you for 3 years, according to Valley gossip. Maybe it's time to let him do it openly." "Because letting Rhett Mercer help me just trades one kind of control for another. Because I can't spend my whole life dependent on men who think they know better than me. Because—" She stopped, all the reasons piling up in her throat. "Because I can't trust him." "You trusted me enough to believe what I just told you." "That's different." "How?" Cole's voice was gentle but insistent. "I'm Gideon Vale's employee telling you to trust his enemy. Rhett Mercer is a cowboy with a bad family name who spent years trying to help you for no reason except he thinks it's right. Which one of us deserves more suspicion?" Mei Lin had no answer for that. In the growing light, she could see the truth of her situation laid out with brutal clarity. She was alone, outmatched, and running out of time. Pride might be a luxury, but survival was a necessity. And if Rhett Mercer was offering help, even unwanted, unasked for help, then maybe it was time to stop refusing it. "Where would I find him?" she asked quietly. "His ranch is 8 miles north, but ma'am?" Cole's expression was serious. "When you ask for help, make sure you're asking as a partner, not as someone surrendering. Men like Rhett, the good ones, they'll give you everything if you let them. but they need to know you're standing beside them, not behind them. He left before she could respond, melting into the pre-dawn shadows like he'd never been there at all. Mei Lin stood alone in her yard, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. In a few hours, Gideon Vale's men would come. In a few hours, everything she'd fought to protect would be destroyed, unless she did something she'd sworn she'd never do. Ask for help. Trust someone. Admit that standing alone wasn't the same as standing strong. She saddled Silver with shaking hands and turned the mare north, toward Rhett Mercer's ranch and whatever came next. Pride was a luxury, her father had said, but he'd also said that dignity was essential, that you could accept help without surrendering yourself, that partnership was different from subjugation if you chose the right partner. She just had to hope that Rhett Mercer was the right choice, and that when she arrived at his door, he'd be willing to forgive everything she'd said and done and help her anyway. The sun was barely clearing the ridge when Mei Lin reached Rhett Mercer's ranch, and she found him already working in the corral, breaking a young colt to lead. He looked up at the sound of her approach, and for a moment, just a moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face before he schooled it back to careful neutrality. Mei Lin. He dropped the lead rope and walked toward the fence, moving slow like she was a skittish animal that might bolt. What's wrong? Straight to the point. No pretense of surprise at seeing her, no questions about why she'd ridden 8 miles after telling him to stay away forever. He just looked at her tired face and smoke-damaged hands and knew that something was desperately wrong. I need help, she said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Gideon Vale is going to kill my cattle today. Maybe kill me too if I get in the way, and I can't stop him alone. Rhett's face went hard as stone. Tell me everything. So she did. Standing in his yard while her horse blew and stamped, she told him about the dammed creek and the poisoned well, about the cut fences and the supplies that mysteriously ran out, about Cole Hendrick's warning, and the men in the hills waiting to stampede her herd into the canyon. She told him everything except the part about how terrified she was, because that much vulnerability felt like stepping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. When she finished, Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, How many men did Cole say? He didn't give a number, just said enough to get the job done. Vale usually keeps 4 or 5 toughs on his payroll for situations like this. Rhett was already moving, heading toward his barn with the kind of focused purpose that suggested he'd been waiting for something exactly like this. We'll need more people. Can't face that many alone, even together. I don't have people, Rhett. I don't have anyone. He stopped, turned to look at her. Your neighbors are either too scared of Vale or too happy to see me fail. The bitterness leaked through despite her best efforts. Samuel Garrett threatened to claim my cattle. The feed store won't sell to me. Even Tom Brennan basically told me to give up and leave. Tom said that. Rhett's voice went dangerously quiet. Not in those words, but that was the message. Mei Lin wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the climbing sun. I'm alone in this valley, Rhett. I have been since my father died. You were the only one who... She stopped, the admission catching in her throat. The only one who... what? The only one who helped, even if I didn't want it, even if I didn't trust it. She met his eyes. I'm sorry for what I said about the fire, about you being obsessed. I was scared and angry, and I took it out on the one person who didn't deserve it. Rhett looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Fear makes people say things they don't mean. I know that better than most. I meant it when I said it. That's what makes it worse. Mei Lin forced herself to hold his gaze. But I was wrong, and if you're willing to help me anyway, I need to know it's not about me being grateful, not about me owing you. I need this to be a partnership, Rhett. 2 people choosing to stand together, not one person rescuing another. That's all I ever wanted it to be. His voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite hiding. Your father was my friend. He stopped, seemed to choose his words carefully. You deserve to keep what's yours, simple as that. It wasn't simple at all, and they both knew it, but it was enough for now. So what do we do? Mei Lin asked. We get help from the one person in this valley who owes Gideon Vale nothing and has reasons to hate him even more than you do. Rhett was already saddling his horse, movements quick and efficient. We get Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to Mei Lin. Who's Marcus Webb? Black Cowboy who runs a small operation on the eastern edge of Vale's territory. Lost half his water rights to Vale 5 years ago through legal tricks and hired intimidation. He's been fighting back ever since. Small ways, quiet ways, but fighting nonetheless. Rhett swung into the saddle. If anyone in this valley will stand against Gideon Vale, it's Marcus. And he's got 3 sons who are almost as stubborn as their father. They rode hard across the valley, pushing the horses faster than was wise, but unable to spare the time for caution. The sun climbed higher with every mile, marking off the hours until Vale's men made their move. Mei Lin found herself watching Rhett as they rode, seeing him differently now that she'd chosen to see him at all. He rode like he'd been born in the saddle, easy and confident, reading the land with the kind of attention that came from years of careful watching. Not the obsessive watching she'd accused him of, but the watchfulness of someone who understood that survival meant paying attention to details other people missed. The way he'd kept his promise to stay away from her property, even when it must have killed him to stand by helpless. The way he'd still come running when her barn was burning, regardless of the cost to himself. The way he'd believed her when she showed up desperate and asking for help, even after everything she'd said and done. They found Marcus Webb mending fence on the northern edge of his property, a tall man with iron gray hair and hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work. He looked up at their approach, and his expression shifted from wary to surprised when he recognized Rhett. "Mercer," Marcus said, setting down his tools. "Don't often see you this far east. And I don't know the lady?" "Mei Lin Zhao, Chen Zhao's daughter." Rhett dismounted and Mei Lin followed his lead. "We need help, Marcus. Gideon Vale is making his move, and we can't stop him alone." Marcus's expression hardened at Vale's name. "What's he done now?" Rhett laid out the situation in quick, efficient sentences, the harassment, the sabotage, the men waiting in the hills. Marcus listened without interrupting, but his hands slowly curled into fists as the story unfolded. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked when Rhett finished. "Hours at most. Maybe less if they get impatient. My boys are working the south pasture. I can have them ready to ride in 20 minutes. Marcus looked at Mei Lin, really looked at her, and something in his expression gentled. "Your father sold me breeding stock at a fair price when every other rancher in this valley tried to cheat me. Told me a man's worth wasn't in his skin, but in his handshake. I owed him better than to stand by while his daughter gets driven off her land." Tears burned at the back of Mei Lin's eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to win this fight." Marcus turned and let out a piercing whistle. 3 men emerged from the pasture in the distance, already moving toward the sound. And winning against Gideon Vale means being willing to do things that won't look good in the clear light of day. "I'm willing," Mei Lin said. "Are you willing to lose everything if this goes wrong? Because that's what we're risking here. Vale has lawyers and money and influence. We've got righteousness and stubbornness, and history shows those don't always win." Rhett spoke up before Mei Lin could answer. "She's already losing everything, Marcus. At least this way she goes down fighting." "Fair enough." Marcus's sons arrived, 3 young men who looked like they'd been carved from the same granite as their father. "Boys, saddle up. We're riding to help the Zhao ranch." The eldest son, a man named Daniel, who looked to be about 30, frowned. "Help how exactly? If this is Vale's doing, riding against him is asking for trouble." "Trouble's already here," Marcus said. "Question is whether we face it or hide from it. I know what your grandfather would have done." That settled it. Within 15 minutes, they were riding back toward Mei Lin's ranch. 7 people instead of 1, 7 sets of eyes and hands and weapons. It should have felt like enough. It didn't. Gideon Vale had resources they couldn't match, influence they couldn't counter, and the kind of ruthless patience that came from never losing. But it was more than Mei Lin had an hour ago, and she'd learned to be grateful for small mercies. They reached her ranch just before noon and found it quiet, too quiet. The cattle were still in the south pasture where she'd left them, but something felt wrong. The air had that peculiar tension that came before storms or violence, like the whole valley was holding its breath. "Spread out," Rhett said quietly. "Check the perimeter. If Vale's men are here, they'll be positioned to drive the herd toward the canyon. We need to know where they are before we can stop them." Marcus and his sons split up, moving with the practiced ease of men who'd worked together for years. Mei Lin started to follow, but Rhett caught her arm. "You should stay at the house," he said. "If this turns into a fight, then I fight." She pulled free, gentle but firm. "This is my land, Rhett. My battle. I'm not hiding while other people risk themselves for it. I'm not asking you to hide, I'm asking you to be smart. You're the one Vale wants broken. If something happens to you, we lose regardless of what happens to the cattle." He was right, and she hated that he was right. But before she could argue further, Daniel Webb came riding back fast, his horse lathered with sweat. "Found them," he said, breathing hard. 8 men positioned in the hills above the south pasture. They've got the high ground and enough firepower to start a small war. 8. Rhett's jaw tightened. That's more than expected. Vale must have brought in extra men from his northern properties. "There's something else." Daniel looked at Mei Lin, and his expression was grim. "They've got blasting powder. Looks like they're planning to start a rock slide, not just a stampede. Bury the herd and anyone trying to protect it." The words hit Mei Lin like a physical blow, not just driving her cattle to death, but ensuring no evidence remained. No witnesses, no proof of what had been done. Just a tragic accident that destroyed her livelihood and conveniently opened her land for purchase by the only man with resources to develop it properly. "We can't let them do this," she said, and her voice shook with rage instead of fear. "We have to stop them." 7 against 8 on high ground? Marcus shook his head. "Those aren't odds I like. We need a different approach. Or we need proof." Rhett's eyes were distant, calculating. Vale's been careful to keep his hands clean, always working through intermediaries. But if we could catch his men in the act, get evidence that holds up, evidence doesn't matter if we're dead, Daniel pointed out. "So we make sure we don't die." Rhett turned to Mei Lin. "Your father kept records, didn't he? Documentation of the water rights, the property boundaries, everything legal and proper?" "Of course, he was meticulous about paperwork." "Where are they kept?" "In his office, the lockbox under the floorboards." Mei Lin's mind was racing, trying to follow Rhett's logic. Why? Because if something happens today, if this goes wrong and Vale wins, at least there will be a record that he worked for it, that you didn't just give up and sell. Rhett's voice was urgent now. And because your father was smart, if he documented everything else, maybe he documented things that could help us now. Things about Vale, about the valley, about what was really happening here. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. Mei Lin ran for the house, Rhett close behind her. The office was exactly as her father had left it, desk cluttered with receipts and ledgers, walls covered with maps of the property and the surrounding territory. She pulled up the loose floorboard and retrieved the heavy iron lockbox, fingers fumbling with the key that hung on a chain around her neck. Inside was exactly what she expected: deeds and water rights, breeding records and sale receipts, everything organized with her father's characteristic precision. But tucked in the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was something she'd never seen before. A journal. Her father's journal, written in a mixture of English and Chinese, covering the last 5 years of his life. Mei Lin's hands shook as she opened it. The entries were brief, factual, recording daily events and business dealings with the same meticulous care he'd given everything else. But as she flipped through the pages, certain names appeared again and again. Gideon Vale, Samuel Garrett, Tom Brennan, and notes about conversations, about pressure applied and refused, about water rights that mysteriously became contested and fences that fell at convenient times. "He knew," she whispered. He knew Vale was coming after the ranch even before he died. Rhett was reading over her shoulder, his expression darkening with every page. "This is evidence, Mei Lin, real evidence. If we can get this to someone outside Vale's influence..." The explosion cut him off. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to rattle the windows and send both of them running for the door. Outside, a column of smoke was rising from the hills above the south pasture. Not the full rock slide yet, but a warning shot, a demonstration of what would come next. Marcus and his sons were already mounted, weapons drawn, facing toward the sound. And riding down from the hills, bold as you please, was a group of 8 armed men with Gideon Vale himself at their head. He sat his expensive horse like a general surveying a battlefield, and when he saw Mei Lin standing in her doorway with Rhett beside her, His smile was terrible in its confidence. "Miss Zhao," he called out, not bothering to dismount. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident. Blasting powder is so unpredictable in these hills. Could bring down half the canyon if it's not handled carefully." "That wasn't an accident, and we both know it." Mei Lin walked forward, her father's journal clutched in her hands like a weapon. "This is intimidation. This is terrorism. And I have evidence of everything you've done, not just today, but for years." Vale's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Evidence? Of what exactly? That I made legitimate business offers? That I've tried to help a struggling young woman who's in over her head? Evidence that you've systematically destroyed my property and threatened my life to force a sale." Mei Lin held up the journal. "My father documented everything, every conversation, every suspicious accident, every time your men cut my fences or dammed my creek. It's all here. A journal." Vale actually laughed. "Written by a dead man in a language half the territory can't read? That's your evidence?" "It's enough to ask questions, enough to bring federal investigators looking into your business practices." Rhett's voice was hard as iron. "Enough to make your life difficult even if it doesn't put you in prison." Vale's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Mercer. Both of you. This valley has an order to it, a natural hierarchy. People who understand their place do well. People who fight against it." He gestured at the smoke still rising from the hills. "Well, accidents happen." "Then arrest him, Tom." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Brennan riding in from the east, his face grim and his hand resting on his sidearm. Behind him rode 4 men Mei Lin didn't recognize, all wearing federal marshal badges. Vale's confident expression slipped for just a moment before recovering. "Tom, how nice of you to join us, though I'm not sure what you think needs arresting. I'm simply here to make another offer on this property before something tragic occurs." "Like a rock slide you arranged?" Tom's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Cole Hendricks came to me this morning, told me everything, the harassment, the sabotage, the plan to destroy the Zhao herd and make it look like an accident. He's willing to testify to all of it. Cole Hendricks is a disgruntled employee who is backed up by 3 other men from your operation who got tired of working for a criminal." One of the federal marshals spoke up, a hard-faced man with gray in his beard. "We've been watching you for 6 months, Vale, waiting for you to make a move big enough to justify federal intervention. Turns out destroying a woman's livelihood and attempting murder qualifies." The world seemed to tilt and resettle. Federal marshals. Cole Hendricks testifying. 6 months of investigation. Mei Lin looked at Tom Brennan and saw shame and determination warring in his weathered face. "I'm sorry," Tom said quietly, looking at her. "I should have acted sooner. Should have stood up when it mattered. But I was scared of going after someone with Vale's resources alone. So I sent for federal help and told myself I was being smart instead of cowardly." "You were being smart," the marshal said. "Local law can't touch men like Vale without outside support. That's what we're here for." He turned to Gideon. "Mr. Vale, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of property, and about a dozen other charges we'll add once we search your records." For a moment, Mei Lin thought Vale might actually fight. His men were armed and they outnumbered the marshals, but apparently even Gideon Vale knew when he was beaten. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff with barely contained rage. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at Mei Lin. "I have lawyers. I have resources. I have influence that reaches further than you can imagine. Maybe," Mei Lin met his eyes without flinching, "but you don't have my land, and you never will." They took him away in irons, him and his men both, leaving behind a silence that felt fragile as spun glass. Mei Lin stood in her yard holding her father's journal and tried to process what had just happened. Victory. Actual victory. After weeks of losing and struggling and standing alone, she'd finally won. Except it didn't feel like victory. It felt like reprieve. Like the moment after a storm passes when you're surveying the damage and trying to figure out what's salvageable. Her barn was still ash. Her well was still poisoned. Her fences were still cut, and her water still dammed, and her cattle still scattered across pastures that would need constant monitoring to keep them safe. Gideon Vale might be arrested, but the damage he'd done remained, and fixing it would take resources she didn't have, and time she couldn't spare. She must have swayed because suddenly Rhett was there, his hand on her elbow, keeping her steady. Easy, he said quietly. It's over. It's not over. It's just different. Mei Lin looked up at him, saw concern, and something deeper in his winter sky eyes. I still don't have a barn. Still don't have clean water. Still don't have... You don't have to do it alone anymore. Marcus Webb spoke up, and his sons nodded agreement. We'll help you clear the dam, dig out the well contamination, rebuild what needs rebuilding. That's what neighbors do. I can't pay you. Didn't ask for payment. Marcus's smile was warm. Your father helped me when I needed it. This is me returning the favor, one generation to the next. That's how it works when people actually act like a community instead of vultures circling wounded prey. Tom Brennan cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, Mei Lin, and some work to make up for standing by too long. I can get the word out to the other ranchers, the good ones, that you're staying and anyone who respects the law better respect your property rights. Mei Lin's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't quite name. Thank you, all of you. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. Rhett's voice held a warning note. Vale might be arrested, but that doesn't mean the danger is over. Men like him have long reaches and longer memories. Until he's actually convicted and sentenced, you're still at risk. As if summoning it by speaking, danger arrived in the form of a rider galloping hard from the direction town. It was Cole Hendricks, and his face was sheet white with panic. They took her, he gasped, fighting to control his heaving horse. Vale's men, the ones who weren't here. They grabbed her and ran. Grabbed who? Mei Lin asked, though cold dread was already settling in her stomach. Miss Zhao, I mean, not you. You're... Cole struggled for words. I'm sorry. I should have been more clear. They took the sheriff's daughter, took her right off the street in broad daylight, and left a note saying if Vale isn't released by sundown, they'll kill her. The world stopped. Tom Brennan made a sound like he'd been gut shot, his face draining of all color. Sarah. They took Sarah. The note says to bring the evidence to the old grain tower on Vale's property, Cole continued, words tumbling over each other. The journal, any testimony, everything. You destroy it all and release Vale, they let her go. You don't. And he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone looked at Mei Lin, at the journal in her hands, at the choice she now faced, her evidence for a girl's life, justice for innocence. The future she'd fought for against the present someone else's daughter was living through in terror. Tom was shaking, his hands curled into useless fists. I have to go. Have to give them what they want. Sarah, she's just 16. She's never hurt anyone. This isn't her fight. It's not her fight, Rhett agreed quietly. But giving Vale what he wants won't end it, Tom. You know that. He'll take the evidence and kill her anyway because she's a witness. Because he can. Because men like him don't leave loose ends. So what do I do? Tom's voice broke. Let my daughter die to prosecute a rich man who will probably buy his way out anyway? Mei Lin looked down at the journal, her father's careful handwriting. His documentation of every wrong done to him, every pressure applied, every injustice endured. He'd kept these records knowing they might matter someday, knowing that truth had value even when it seemed powerless. But her father had also taught her that principles without compassion were just another form of cruelty. She held out the journal to Tom. Take it. Trade it for Sarah. Your daughter's life is worth more than my revenge. Mei Lin, Rhett started, but she cut him off with a look. No, this isn't negotiable. I won't build my future on a girl's grave. I won't become the kind of person who sacrifices innocence for principles. She pressed the journal into Tom's shaking hands. Go, get your daughter back. Tom looked at her with tears streaming down his weathered face. I don't deserve this. Don't deserve your mercy after I failed you. None of us get what we deserve, Tom. We get what we choose, and I choose Sarah's life over my justice. Mei Lin's voice was steady even as her heart cracked. Now go before it's too late. But Rhett caught Tom's arm before he could mount up. Wait, there might be another way. What way? Tom's voice was desperate, drowning man desperate. You heard the terms. Evidence for Sarah. There's no negotiation. No negotiation, but maybe a trick. Rhett was already moving, pulling Tom toward the house. How many pages in that journal? Maybe 100, Mei Lin said, confused.
And how carefully do you think Vale's men actually looked at it? They know it exists, they know it's a threat, but do they know exactly what's in it? Rhett was in Chen's office now, pulling books from shelves, scattering papers across the desk. We make a fake journal, same size, same binding, but filled with legitimate ranch records instead of evidence. From a distance, in poor light, it would pass inspection long enough to get Sarah to safety. And then what? Marcus asked. They realize it's fake and come after all of us? By then, the real evidence is on its way to the territorial capital with the federal marshals. Vale's already in custody. His men are leaderless and exposed. Rhett was working as he talked, his hands quick and sure. We give them the fake, save Sarah, and keep the real evidence safe. Everyone wins except Vale. It was a good plan, a clever plan. But Mei Lin saw the flaw immediately. They'll want to verify it before they release her.
They're not stupid enough to make an exchange without checking that they're getting what they want. Then we make them verify it from a distance. Rhett looked up, and his eyes held a fierce determination that made her breath catch. I'll deliver it. I'll go to the grain tower alone, show them the journal from far enough away that they can see it exists, but not close enough to realize it's fake. Once they release Sarah, once she's clear, I'll hand it over and get out. That's suicide, Daniel Webb said flatly. The moment they realize you tricked them. The moment they realize I tricked them, I'll already be running. I know that territory better than anyone except maybe Vale himself. I can lose them in the canyons and double back to safety. Or they can shoot you in the back the second you turn around. Mei Lin's voice was sharp with fear. This is insane, Rhett. You can't. I can and I will. He met her eyes. 3 years I watched over you. 3 years of trying to help from the shadows. This is my chance to actually do something that matters. To save someone without it being complicated or misunderstood or twisted into something it's not. It matters, Mei Lin said quietly, what you did. The watching. The protecting. I understand that now. You don't have to prove anything. Maybe I need to prove it to myself. Rhett was already creating the fake journal, pulling pages from various ledgers and binding them together with practiced ease. I've spent my whole life trying to be different from my father, trying to show this valley that the Mercer name could mean something good. This is my chance to actually be the man I've been pretending to be. There was no arguing with him. Mei Lin saw that in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands moved with absolute certainty. He'd made his choice just like she'd made hers, both of them choosing principle over safety, both of them risking everything for people who might not even appreciate the sacrifice. Then I'm going with you, she said. Absolutely not. Not negotiable, she crossed her arms. You said this was a partnership. Partners don't let each other walk into danger alone. Partners also don't let each other make stupid choices out of guilt or obligation. Rhett's voice was gentle but firm. This is my decision, Mei Lin. My risk. You've done enough by giving up the evidence in the first place. I gave up the evidence to save Sarah, not to watch you die in my place. Mei Lin felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. If you go alone and they kill you, that's on me. That's one more person who helped me and paid for it with their life. I can't carry that weight, Rhett. I won't. They stared at each other, deadlocked in stubborn determination that mirrored like a reflection. Marcus cleared his throat. Seems to me you're both being idiots, he said mildly. But if you're determined to do this fool thing, at least do it smart. Rhett goes in to make the exchange. The rest of us position ourselves around the grain tower, far enough not to be seen, close enough to provide cover if things go wrong. We can't stop them from shooting, but we can make sure they regret it. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than Rhett going alone, better than standing by helpless, while a girl died and a good man threw his life away. Sometimes better was the best you could hope for. They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Rhett finished the fake journal while Mei Lin packed the real one with supplies for the marshal's journey to the capital. Marcus and his sons checked weapons and planned approaches to the grain tower. Tom Brennan sat silent and shaking, a father's worst nightmare playing out in real time while he tried to hold himself together enough to function. As the sun started its descent toward the western mountains, they rode out together, 7 people united by desperation and hope, and the fragile belief that sometimes righteous stubbornness was enough to tip the scales against overwhelming odds. The grain tower rose against the darkening sky like a skeletal finger pointing toward heaven. It had been abandoned for years, one of Vale's failed investments left to rot, when the railroad decided to route through different territory. 3 stories of timber and corrugated metal, listing slightly to one side, surrounded by empty fields where wheat had once grown. Rhett rode in alone as planned, the fake journal tucked in his saddlebag, while the others spread out in a loose perimeter. Mei Lin crouched behind an outcropping 50 yards from the tower's entrance, rifle loaded, and her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She could see Sarah Brennan through the tower's broken windows, a young girl with her father's eyes and her mother's dark hair, tied to a support beam on the second floor. 2 men stood guard over her, both armed, both watching the approaches with the wary attention of men who knew they were breaking laws that could get them hanged. Rhett reined in 30 feet from the tower entrance. "I've got what you want," he called out. "The journal. Everything Chen Zhao documented about Vale's operations. You let the girl go, you get the book." A man emerged from the tower, one of Vale's lieutenants, a hard-eyed bastard named Frank Crow, who'd been present at the confrontation earlier. "Show me." Rhett held up the journal, angling it so the light caught the pages. "Here it is. Now send out the girl." "Not how this works, Mercer. You bring the journal to me, I verify it's real, then we discuss releasing the hostage." "Verify it from there. I open it. You look at the pages. You see it's what you want." Frank's expression darkened. "You think I'm stupid? I know Chen Zhao's handwriting. Need to see it close to make sure you're not trying to trick us. And I need to see Sarah walking free before I hand over anything." Rhett's voice was steady, but Mei Lin could see tension in his shoulders. "We can stand here arguing about trust, or we can make the trade and both get what we want. What I want is that journal in my hands, and you dead in the dirt for making this complicated." Frank raised his voice. "Boys, seems Mr. Mercer needs motivation." The sound of a hammer being pulled back echoed through the evening air. Up on the second floor, one of the guards pressed a pistol against Sarah's head. The girl whimpered, and Tom Brennan made a strangled sound from wherever he was hidden. "Last chance," Frank said. "Bring me the journal or watch her brains paint the wall." Rhett's hands tightened on his reins, and Mei Lin saw the moment he made his decision. He was going to do it, going to ride forward and hand over the fake, and hope he could get away before they realized what he'd done. It was brave and stupid and absolutely certain to get him killed. Mei Lin stood up from behind the outcropping. "Wait!" she called out, stepping into view with the real journal held high. "I've got what you actually want." Every head turned toward her. Rhett's face went white, then red with fury. "Mei Lin, get back. This is the real journal," she continued, ignoring him. "The one Rhett has is a fake. I'm sure Frank is smart enough to recognize that once he actually looks at it." She walked forward slowly, journal extended like an offering. "You want evidence destroyed? This is the evidence. But I'm the one who brings it to you, not him. Mei Lin, don't you dare!" She kept walking, kept her eyes on Frank instead of on Rhett, because if she looked at him, she might lose her nerve. "Let Sarah go. Take the journal. Leave Rhett and everyone else alone. Those are my terms." Frank laughed, ugly and sharp. "You don't get to make terms, girl. You're Chinese trash on land you don't deserve. Only reason you're still breathing is because killing you openly would make Vale's lawyers work harder. Then make it look like an accident." Mei Lin stopped 10 feet from the tower entrance. "The grain tower's unstable. Could collapse any time. If I happened to be inside when it fell..." She shrugged. "Tragic, but not murder. Vale's lawyers would love that." Understanding flickered across Frank's face, then calculation. He was weighing options, measuring risks, trying to figure out if this was a trick or an opportunity. Behind her, Mei Lin heard Rhett dismounting, heard his boots hitting the dirt as he started toward her. She spoke quickly before he could reach her. "There's blasting powder in the tower foundation," she said, the lie coming smooth as silk. "I can see the fuse from here. You were planning to bring it down anyway, weren't you? After you got the journal? No witnesses, no evidence, just rubble and unfortunate casualties." Frank's expression confirmed the truth of her guess. "So take the journal," Mei Lin continued. "Light your fuse. Let Sarah and Rhett leave first. I know you'll let them go because killing a sheriff's daughter and the valley's most notorious busybody would bring more attention than Vale wants. Just me. Just the girl who doesn't belong here anyway.
Everyone wins. Except you, Frank said. Except me. Mei Lin met his eyes. But I'm choosing this. Same way my father chose to come to this valley, knowing it might kill him. Same way I chose to stay after he died. Sometimes the choice isn't between winning and losing. Sometimes it's between dying on your feet or living on your knees. She'd almost reached the tower entrance when Rhett caught her arm, spinning her around with enough force to make her stumble. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice shook with fury and fear. You can't trade yourself for everyone else? Why not? Mei Lin met his eyes. You were going to do the same thing 5 minutes ago. That's different. How? Because you're a man and I'm a woman? Because your life matters less than mine somehow? She pulled free of his grip. This is my choice, Rhett. My land. My father's legacy. My decision how to protect it. By dying, that's not protection. That's surrender. No. Surrender would be selling to Vale and running away. This is making sure that even if I don't survive, the evidence does. The marshals have the real journal. This is just insurance. And if Frank thinks blowing up the tower will destroy the evidence, then he'll do exactly that without checking too carefully. She touched his face, brief and gentle. Trust me. Please. Rhett looked at her like she was something precious and breaking. I can't lose you. Not now. Not after... After what? After 3 years of watching? After I finally admitted I was wrong about you? Mei Lin smiled, and it hurt worse than crying. Better to lose me this way than watch me bend until I break. You understand that. I know you do. She turned away before he could argue further and walked into the grain tower. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old grain and rotting wood. The floor creaked ominously under her weight, and she could see places where boards had given way entirely, revealing the dark space beneath. Sarah was sobbing quietly, and Mei Lin met the girl's eyes with as much reassurance as she could manage. It's going to be okay, she said softly. You're going to be fine. Frank followed her in, pistol drawn, and pointed at her back. The journal. Mei Lin held it out, and he snatched it from her hands, flipping through pages with the quick efficiency of someone who knew what to look for. She'd gambled that he'd recognize enough to be satisfied without reading carefully enough to realize she'd given him the fake after all, the one Rhett had been carrying, the one she'd swapped out when she stood up from behind the outcropping. The real journal was tucked in her boot, pressed against her calf where it would stay hidden unless they stripped her, and she was betting they wouldn't bother. Dead women didn't need searching. Frank finished his inspection and nodded to his men. Cut her loose. They freed Sarah, who stumbled forward into Mei Lin's arms with the desperate clutch of the terrified. Mei Lin held her for a moment, then gently pushed her toward the door. Go to your father, she whispered. Run fast and don't look back. Sarah fled, her footsteps echoing on the unstable floor. Through the broken windows, Mei Lin could see Rhett waiting, could see him catch Sarah and push her toward Tom, could see him start toward the tower entrance with the clear intention of coming after her. Frank saw it too and laughed. Loyal, isn't he? You must be quite something to inspire that kind of stupid devotion. Let him think he can save me, Mei Lin said quietly. It'll distract him while you light your fuse. Smart and practical, almost ashamed to kill you. Frank gestured to his men. Do it! They moved fast, one pulling a match, the other heading for the tower's foundation, where the blasting powder must be hidden. Mei Lin watched them work and felt a strange calm settle over her. This was it then. The end she'd somehow known was coming from the moment her father died and left her alone in a valley that didn't want her. At least she'd go out fighting. At least the evidence would survive, and Vale would face justice, and Sarah would live to marry someone kind and have children who never knew how close they'd come to never existing. At least Rhett would remember her as brave instead of broken. The fuse caught with a sizzle and spark, and Frank's men ran for the entrance, leaving her alone in the center of the tower with fire crawling toward the foundation and maybe 30 seconds before the whole structure came down. Mei Lin closed her eyes and thought of her father, of his quiet strength and his careful wisdom, of the way he'd believed she could make a life here if she was just stubborn enough to outlast the cruelty. She'd been stubborn. It hadn't been enough. But maybe... The explosion of shattering wood came from the wrong direction. Mei Lin's eyes flew open to see Rhett Mercer crashing through the tower's back wall on horseback, the animal screaming in terror but obedient to his hands. He reached down without slowing, and she had maybe a second to decide, stay
and die with dignity, or grab his arm and live without it. She grabbed his arm. He hauled her up behind him with strength that shouldn't have been possible, and then they were riding, the horse's hooves thundering on the unstable floor as the fuse burned down and the tower groaned its death song. She wrapped her arms around Rhett's waist and pressed her face against his back and felt him drive the terrified horse straight toward the front entrance where Frank and his men were diving for cover. They exploded out of the tower 3 seconds before it exploded behind them. The blast was enormous, a rolling wave of heat and sound and destruction that picked them up and threw them forward like toys. Mei Lin felt herself flying, felt Rhett's body wrapping around hers to take the impact, felt the ground slam into them hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Then darkness and silence and the smell of smoke that was becoming entirely too familiar. She woke to stars overhead and Rhett's voice in her ear, rough and desperate. "Breathe. Come on, Mei Lin, breathe. You don't get to die after I just pulled off the most insane rescue in territorial history. Breathe, damn you." She breathed. It hurt like hell, every rib screaming protest, but she breathed, and when she could finally focus her eyes, she saw his face hovering over hers, filthy and bloody, and more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I came back. I've been coming back for 3 years. His hands were checking her for injuries, gentle despite their shaking. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" "I think so." She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, but nothing felt broken. Just bruised, just battered, just alive when she should have been dead. The tower? Rubble. Frank and his men ran when they saw it coming down. Marshals got 2 of them, but Frank got away. Rhett helped her sit up slowly, supporting her weight like she might shatter. "You gave them the fake journal, didn't you? Switched them somehow?" "You noticed. I notice everything about you. Haven't you figured that out yet?" His voice cracked. "You could have died. You almost did die. And for what? A book? For Sarah, for justice, for the principle that monsters like Vale don't win just because they have money and power." Mei Lin touched his face, fingers coming away bloody. "You're hurt. I'm fine. We're both fine. That's what matters." Rhett pulled her close, and she felt him shaking against her. "Don't ever do that again. Don't ever make me watch you walk into death without me. Then don't ask me to watch you do the same." She pulled back enough to see his eyes. "We're partners, remember? That means neither of us gets to play hero alone." "Partners," he repeated, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "Is that what we are?" "I don't know what we are," Mei Lin admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose it, whatever it is. Whatever it could be." "Good. Because I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever. Even if you order me away again, even if you hate me, even if—" She kissed him. It wasn't graceful or romantic or anything like the stories said first kisses should be. They were both covered in blood and dust, both tasting of smoke and fear, both shaking with adrenaline and relief. But it was real. It was theirs. And when they finally pulled apart, Rhett was looking at her like she'd hung the stars just for him. "Took you long enough," Marcus Webb's voice came from somewhere nearby, amused and warm. "Thought I'd have to knock your heads together before you 2 figured it out." They weren't alone. Tom was there, holding Sarah, who was crying with relief. The Webb family was there, checking weapons and horses. The marshals were there, securing the 2 captured men and looking grim about the one who got away. And in Mei Lin's boot, pressed against her calf where it had survived the blast and the fall and the desperate escape, the real journal waited to tell its truth. They'd won. Against all odds, against all sense, against every advantage Gideon Vale had thrown at them, they'd won. The cost had been high. The scars would be permanent. But standing there in the wreckage with Rhett's arms around her and allies she'd never expected at her back, Mei Lin finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her. Strength wasn't standing alone. Strength was knowing when to stand together, when to accept help, when to trust that partnership didn't mean surrender and love didn't mean losing yourself. The night was far from over. Frank Crow was still free. Vale still had resources even in custody, and rebuilding everything that had been destroyed would take months of brutal work. But for the first time since her father died, Mei Lin Zhao wasn't facing it alone. And that made all the difference in the world. The federal marshals left at first light,
taking the captured men and Chen Zhao's journal with them toward the territorial capital where lawyers and judges would pick apart Gideon Vale's empire piece by piece. Tom Brennan rode with them, Sarah tucked close to his side, the girl still shaking but whole and alive, and that was all that mattered. Before they left, Tom had gripped Mei Lin's hand hard enough to hurt. "I won't forget what you did," he said, voice rough with emotion. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Won't forget that you were willing to trade your life for my daughters. That's a debt I can never repay." "Then don't try to repay it," Mei Lin had told him. "Just remember it next time someone needs help and the cost looks too high. Remember that sometimes the right thing is expensive, but the wrong thing costs even more." He'd nodded, unable to speak, and rode away with tears still wet on his weathered face. Now, standing in her yard as the sun climbed over the eastern ridge, Mei Lin surveyed what remained of her world. The barn was still ash and blackened timber. The well was still poisoned. The fences were still cut, and the creek still dammed, and every single problem that had existed before the confrontation at the grain tower remained exactly as dire as it had been. Except now she wasn't facing any of it alone. Marcus Webb and his sons had stayed, setting up a temporary camp in her south pasture where the cattle grazed near the spring-fed pond. Rhett had refused to leave at all, sleeping on her porch the previous night like a guard dog, and she'd been too exhausted to argue about propriety or appearances or what the valley might say about a man spending the night at an unmarried woman's property. Let them talk. They'd been talking about her since the day she was born. "Coffee's ready?" Rhett called from the porch, and Mei Lin turned to see him standing in the doorway of her father's house like he belonged there. He'd washed the blood and dust from his face, but bruises were already darkening across his jaw and temple, souvenirs of their desperate escape from the exploding grain tower. "And I found eggs in the hen house. Not sure how you've been keeping chickens fed with everything else falling apart, but they're still laying. My father always said chickens were the most stubborn creatures on earth." Mei Lin climbed the porch steps, accepting the coffee cup he offered. "Said they'd lay eggs through drought, flood, and apocalypse out of pure spite." "Smart man, your father." Rhett settled against the porch rail, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I've been thinking about what comes next, about what you need to get this place running again. I need about 100 things I can't afford, and another 100 I wouldn't know how to do even if I could pay for them." Mei Lin sipped the coffee, strong and bitter and perfect. "But I'll figure it out, same way my father did, one problem at a time. Or you could accept help." Rhett's voice was careful, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Marcus already offered to help clear the dam and clean out the well. I've got timber on my property we could use to rebuild the barn. Between all of us, we could have this place functional again in a few weeks. And what do I give you in return?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, old instincts rising up despite her best efforts to suppress them. "I don't have money to pay wages, don't have anything except land that's more trouble than it's worth. You give us the satisfaction of knowing we helped someone who needed it." Rhett met her eyes. "Not everything is a transaction, Mei Lin. Sometimes people help because it's right, not because they expect payment." She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the help without suspicion, without calculating the hidden costs and obligations. But a lifetime of learning that generosity always came with strings attached was hard to unlearn in a single morning. "I'm trying," she said quietly, "to trust, to believe that partnership doesn't mean losing myself. But it's hard, Rhett. Every instinct I have says accepting help makes me weak, makes me dependent, makes me the kind of woman who needs rescuing." "You jumped into an exploding building to save a girl you barely knew," Rhett pointed out. "You faced down Gideon Vale without flinching. You were ready to die rather than surrender evidence that could bring him to justice. That's not weakness, Mei Lin. That's the opposite of weakness. Then why does accepting help feel like surrender? Because you've spent your whole life confusing strength with isolation." Rhett's voice was gentle but firm. "Your father was strong, but he wasn't alone. He had friends, had people he could count on. That's what made him successful. Not his ability to do everything himself, but his wisdom in knowing when to ask for support." Mei Lin thought about her father's journal, about all those careful notations of who owed him favors and who he owed in return, about the web of reciprocal obligation that had protected him for 15 years. He'd understood something she was still learning,
that community wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a resource to be cultivated. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Don't know how to let people help without feeling like I'm failing somehow. Then learn. Same way you learned everything else, by trying and making mistakes and trying again. Rhett shifted closer, and this time their shoulders did touch. You don't have to be perfect at accepting help, Mei Lin. You just have to be willing to try. Marcus appeared around the corner of the house before she could respond, his sons trailing behind him with tools and determined expressions. Talked it over with the boys, Marcus said without preamble. We figure the dam is the first priority. Get your water flowing again, everything else gets easier. We can have it cleared by this afternoon if we all work together. I can't ask you to... You're not asking, we're offering. Marcus's smile was warm. Big difference between those two things. Now, you coming with us or staying here to supervise the ranch? Mei Lin looked at Rhett, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at Marcus and his sons, at the casual competence in their stance and the genuine willingness to help in their expressions. These weren't men looking to take advantage. These were neighbors acting like community was supposed to work. I'm coming, she said, setting down her coffee cup. My land, my water. I should be there when we get it back. They rode up to the canyon together, 5 people united in purpose, if not in history. The dam was exactly where Mei Lin had found it days earlier, heavy stones and timber wedged into the narrow gap where water emerged from underground springs. It should have taken days to dismantle alone, but with multiple sets of hands and Marcus's patient direction about leverage points and load distribution, they had the first stones moved within an hour. Your father chose his land well, Marcus commented as they worked, muscles straining against the weight of water-smoothed boulders. This creek runs year-round, fed by snowmelt and deep springs. That's worth more than gold in this territory. It's why Vale wanted it, Daniel Webb added, wiping sweat from his forehead. Man's been trying to consolidate water rights across the whole valley for years. Your place was the last major independent source he didn't control. Mei Lin had known that intellectually, but hearing it confirmed made the scope of Vale's ambition more real. This wasn't just about a ranch, it was about power. The power to control who prospered and who failed, who got water for their cattle and crops, and who watched their livelihood wither from thirst. Will the marshals actually be able to convict him? She asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since they'd ridden away. Or will his lawyers find some way to get him released? Evidence is solid, Rhett said, straining against a particularly stubborn timber. The journal, Cole Hendrick's testimony, the 2 men they arrested at the grain tower. And once word gets out that Vale's in custody, others will come forward. People he's intimidated and cheated over the years. The dam breaks once someone has the courage to be first. You were first, Marcus pointed out, looking at Mei Lin. You stood up when standing up looked like suicide. That matters. People will remember. They worked in companionable shunts after that. The only sounds the splash of redirected water and the grunt of effort as heavy stones were levered aside. Slowly, inexorably, the dam came apart. And as the final timber was pulled free, water surged through the gap with a roar that sounded like celebration. Mei Lin stood ankle-deep in the creek as it rushed past, cold and clean, and hers again, and felt something loosen in her chest. One problem solved. One piece of her father's legacy restored. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Next is the well, Marcus said, reading her expression correctly. That's more complicated. Need to draw out the contaminated water and treat what remains, then test it to make sure it's safe. Could take a few days. I've got time, Mei Lin said. For the first time in weeks, I actually have time. They rode back to the ranch in the golden light of late afternoon and found they weren't alone. 3 wagons were parked in the yard, and people were unloading supplies, timber and nails, sacks of grain, rolls of wire fencing. Mei Lin recognized some of them, the blacksmith's wife, the feed store owner's son, the widow Thompson who ran the boarding house in town. What's all this? She asked, dismounting in confusion. The widow Thompson stepped forward, a tall woman with kind eyes and hands roughened by years of hard work. Heard about what happened at Vale's grain tower. Heard you stood up to him, put yourself in danger to save Tom Brennan's girl. Figured it was time we stopped being scared and started being decent neighbors. I don't understand. We've all been intimidated by Vale in one way or another. the feed store owner's son said, a young man named Peter who couldn't be more than 20. He threatened my father with running us out of business if we sold supplies to you, threatened others with worse. We went along because we were afraid, and that makes us cowards. So we're here to make it right, the blacksmith's wife added. Can't undo what's already been done, but we can help you rebuild. That's a start, at least. Mei Lin felt her throat tighten with emotion. I can't pay for all this. We're not asking payment. We're asking forgiveness for standing by when we should have helped. The widow Thompson's voice was firm. Your father was a good man who treated everyone fairly, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. We failed him when he died. We're not going to fail his daughter too. The supplies kept coming, more than Mei Lin could have afforded, even with a good year's cattle sales, more than she'd dared to hope for in her most optimistic moments. Timber for a new barn, wire for new fences, grain to feed her cattle through the coming winter, tools and nails and practical necessities that transformed impossible tasks into merely difficult ones. By evening, the yard looked like a construction site, organized chaos where there had been desolation that morning. Marcus and his sons had already started laying out the barn foundation, using the old footprint but improving on Chen's original design with lessons learned from 15 years of harsh winters. Rhett worked alongside them, and Mei Lin found herself watching him when she should have been planning fence repairs, watching the easy competence of his movements, the way he listened to Marcus's suggestions without ego, the way he'd glance toward her periodically like he needed to confirm she was still there. You should tell him, the widow Thompson said quietly, appearing at Mei Lin's elbow with the stealth of someone who'd raised 6 children and learned to move quietly. That boy's been in love with you for 3 years, according to Valley gossip. Time you either put him out of his misery or let him know the feeling's mutual. It's complicated. Love usually is, but life's too short and this valley's too hard to waste time being complicated when you could be happy instead. The widow smiled. Take it from someone who learned that lesson too late. My husband and I wasted 5 years dancing around each other because I thought accepting his affection made me weak. When he finally wore me down and I admitted I loved him back, we had 20 good years together. Would have been 25 if I'd been less stubborn. What if accepting help means losing myself, becoming dependent on someone else for my survival? What if it doesn't? The widow's voice was gentle. What if accepting help means gaining a partner instead of losing yourself? What if the strongest thing you can do is admit you don't have to carry everything alone? She walked away before Mei Lin could answer, leaving her standing in the yard with those questions circling her mind like persistent birds. What if accepting help didn't mean surrender? What if partnership could exist without one person dominating the other? What if the thing she'd been most afraid of was actually the thing that could save her? The work continued for 3 days. People came and went, contributing what they could when they could, slowly transforming the Zhao Ranch from disaster site to functioning operation. The barn rose timber by timber, taking shape with remarkable speed under Marcus's patient direction. The fences were mended with new wire that gleamed silver in the sunlight. The well was drawn down and treated with lime and patience until clean water finally emerged again, cold and pure and safe to drink. On the 4th morning, Mei Lin woke to the sound of hammering and found Rhett on the barn roof, securing the final sheets of corrugated metal that would keep the weather out. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent countless hours on high places, and she watched him work until he noticed her attention and nearly fell off the ladder. You're going to kill yourself showing off, she called up to him. Not showing off, just finishing what we started. He climbed down carefully and stood before her, dusty and disheveled and somehow more attractive than any man had a right to be. Barn's done, wells clean, fences are mended, creeks flowing. You're back in business, Mei Lin Zhao. Thanks to you, thanks to everyone. She looked around at her transformed property, hardly recognizing it from the disaster it had been a week ago. I don't know how to thank you properly. Don't know what's adequate for the kind of help you've all given. Thank us by succeeding, by proving that good people can win sometimes, even in a valley as hard as this one. Rhett wiped his hands on his pants, suddenly looking uncertain, and maybe by letting me stay close enough to see you do it. How close? As close as you'll allow. His voice was careful, like he was walking on uncertain ground. I know I came on too strong before, watched when I should have asked permission, helped when you wanted to handle things yourself. But I'm trying to learn, Mei Lin, trying to understand the difference between protecting someone and trusting them to protect themselves. And if I said I wanted you close, really close, what would that look like? Rhett's breath caught. Depends what you mean by close. I mean partnership, real partnership, where we both have equal say in decisions. Where your ranch and my ranch stay separate, but our lives don't. Where I can ask for help without feeling weak, and you can offer it without thinking I'm obligated to accept. Mei Lin stepped closer, close enough to see the hope warring with caution in his expression. I mean the kind of close where I don't have to wonder if you're watching from the ridge because you'll be right here beside me instead. That's, Rhett's voice cracked. That's everything I've wanted for 3 years. Everything I didn't dare hope for because I knew I'd messed up too badly to deserve it. You didn't mess up. You just loved someone who wasn't ready to be loved yet. Mei Lin reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble of days without proper shaving, the warmth of skin still heated from working in the sun. I'm ready now. Scared, but ready. If you're willing to be patient with someone still learning how to accept help without feeling like she's surrendering, I'll be so patient you'll get sick of it, Rhett promised. And then he was kissing her, right there in the yard with Marcus and his sons pretending not to notice, and the widow Thompson smiling from the porch like she'd personally arranged the whole thing. The kiss was better than the first one, less desperate, more certain, flavored with hope instead of fear. When they finally pulled apart, Rhett was grinning like a fool, and Mei Lin couldn't quite catch her breath. So what now? She asked. Now we figure out how to run 2 ranches that might as well be one. Now we show this valley what partnership looks like when it's built on respect instead of obligation. Now we... He was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. They turned to see Sheriff Tom Brennan riding in hard, his face grim in a way that sent ice through Mei Lin's veins. They found Frank Crow, Tom said without preamble, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. Dead, shot twice in the back and left in a canyon 10 miles from the territorial capital. Vale's work? Rhett asked, though they all knew the answer. Has to be. Frank was the only one who could testify directly to Vale giving orders to destroy property and threaten lives. With him dead, Vale's lawyers are already claiming he knew nothing about what his men were doing, saying Frank was acting on his own initiative, trying to impress the boss by running off competition. Mei Lin felt sick. Will it work? Can Vale actually get away with this? Maybe. Probably. Tom's voice was heavy with defeat. The other 2 men we captured are saying the same thing now, that Frank told them he had approval, but they never heard Vale give actual orders. Cole Hendrick's testimony helps, but he wasn't present for most of the planning. And your father's journal documents harassment, but doesn't prove direct involvement. So we risked everything for nothing. The words came out flat, emotionless. Sarah almost died, Rhett and I almost died, and Vale walks away because he was smart enough to keep his hands clean. Not for nothing, Tom corrected. Vale's reputation is destroyed. His business relationships are falling apart. Even if he avoids prison, he's finished in this territory. People know what he is now, and that matters. It doesn't matter if he's free to keep hurting people. Which is why I need your help. Tom looked between Mei Lin and Rhett. The prosecutor wants to put you both on the stand. Wants you to testify about the harassment, the intimidation, the attempt on your lives at the grain tower. It won't be enough to convict on the serious charges, but combined with everything else, it might be enough to get him convicted on something. Put him away for a few years at least. Mei Lin thought about standing in a courtroom, facing Gideon Vale across polished wood and legal formality. Thought about reliving every moment of fear and frustration while his expensive lawyers tried to discredit her testimony and paint her as a vindictive immigrant making false accusations against a respected businessman. It sounded like torture, like volunteering to be humiliated in front of everyone who'd ever doubted she belonged in this valley. I'll do it, she said. Mei Lin, Rhett started, but she cut him off with a look. I'll do it because someone has to. Because if good people won't speak up, then men like Vale keep winning. Because my father taught me that dignity isn't about avoiding difficulty, but about facing it with your head held high. She turned back to Tom. When does the trial start? 3 weeks. In the territorial capital. You'll need to be there for at least a week, maybe longer depending on how the defense drags things out. Tom paused. I know it's asking a lot. No, it's dangerous too. Vale still has supporters, and they won't be happy about you testifying against him. I don't care about happy. I care about justice. Mei Lin felt Rhett's hand find hers, squeezing support and solidarity. And I won't be going alone. The 3 weeks before the trial passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. The ranch was functional again. The immediate crises solved, but running it alone while also preparing to testify felt overwhelming. Mei Lin found herself relying on Rhett more than she'd ever relied on anyone except her father, trusting him to handle cattle moves while she reviewed her father's journal with the prosecutor, accepting his company on long rides when the stress got too heavy to carry alone, falling asleep on his shoulder some nights when exhaustion won out over propriety. Marcus and his sons took turns helping with the daily work, refusing payment but accepting dinner and gratitude. The widow Thompson brought food when Mei Lin forgot to cook, which was often. Peter from the feed store made sure supplies were delivered on time without being asked. Slowly, almost without noticing, Mei Lin found herself surrounded by community in a way she'd never experienced before. People cared. People helped. People showed up when it mattered, not because they expected anything in return, but because that's what neighbors did when they decided to actually be neighborly instead of just tolerating each other's existence. It was strange and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. The journey to the territorial capital took 2 days by wagon, and Rhett insisted on driving despite Mei Lin's protests that she could handle the reins herself. "I know you can handle them," he'd said, settling onto the wagon seat like the matter was already decided. "But I'm going anyway because you shouldn't have to do this alone and because I want to. Those are 2 separate reasons, and both of them matter." So they traveled together, sleeping under the stars at night with the wagon between them for propriety's sake, even though Mei Lin suspected the valley was well past caring about such niceties. They talked about everything and nothing, about Rhett's childhood watching his mother work herself to exhaustion, about Mei Lin's memories of China before her father brought her to this harsh new world, about dreams for the future that didn't seem quite as impossible now that they were building them together. The territorial capital was larger than Blackthorn Ridge, loud and crowded with the kind of impersonal bustle that came from too many people living too close together. The courthouse was an imposing brick building that made Mei Lin feel small and out of place, and walking up those steps with Rhett's steadying hand on her elbow was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Inside, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor Hastings, who'd made her reputation breaking up land fraud schemes, met them with brisk efficiency. "You'll testify tomorrow," she said, looking Mei Lin over with the assessing gaze of someone calculating how a witness would appear to a jury. "Defense is going to come at you hard. They'll question your credibility, imply you're making accusations out of spite or greed. They'll bring up your father's immigrant status and suggest you don't understand American property law. They'll do everything they can to make the jury doubt your word." "Let them try," Mei Lin said, with more confidence than she felt. Good attitude. But understand, this isn't about proving Vale ordered every specific act of harassment. It's about establishing a pattern of intimidation and showing he benefited from it. Your testimony about the systematic pressure, combined with the journal and Cole Hendrick's account, creates reasonable doubt about his claims of ignorance. Will it be enough to convict him? Eleanor's expression was carefully neutral. It should be, but juries are unpredictable, especially when the defendant is wealthy and connected. All we can do is present the truth and hope justice wins out. The trial started the next morning with all the formality and tedium that legal proceedings entailed. Mei Lin sat in the gallery and watched as lawyers argued about technicalities and procedures she barely understood, watched as a jury of 12 men, no women, of course, listened with expressions ranging from interest to boredom. And she watched Gideon Vale sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking calm and confident like this was all just a minor inconvenience. When Eleanor called her name, Mei Lin stood and walked to the witness stand with her spine straight and her head high, exactly as her father would have wanted. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the hard wooden chair and looked out at the courtroom full of strangers who would decide whether justice mattered more than money. Eleanor's questions were straightforward, establishing the timeline of harassment, the systematic destruction of property, the escalating threats that culminated in the grain tower confrontation. Mei Lin answered truthfully, keeping her voice steady even when recounting the most frightening moments, making sure the jury understood that this wasn't about one incident, but about months of calculated pressure designed to break her will. Then the defense attorney stood up, and the real battle began. He was younger than Mei Lin expected, handsome in the way that came from good breeding and better tailoring, and his smile was sharp as a knife.
Miss Zhao, he said, making her name sound foreign and strange. You claim my client systematically targeted your property for destruction. But isn't it true that you've experienced financial difficulties since your father's death? That you've struggled to maintain the ranch he built? I face challenges, yes.
That doesn't mean challenges that might make someone desperate for money, perhaps desperate enough to fabricate accusations against a wealthy man in hopes of a settlement? Eleanor objected immediately, but the seed was planted. The jury had heard the suggestion, and no amount of legal maneuvering could make them unhear it. The defense attorney continued, each question designed to chip away at her credibility. He suggested she'd misunderstood American business practices. He implied her father's journal was unreliable, possibly forged. He questioned whether a young woman could really know the difference between bad luck and deliberate sabotage. He never quite called her a liar. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. But Mei Lin had faced worse than condescending lawyers. She'd faced Gideon Vale himself, had stared down his threats and his guns, and his absolute certainty that he could take whatever he wanted. Compared to that, this was just words. I understand American business practices perfectly well, she said when the attorney paused for breath. I understand that legitimate businesses don't dam their competitors' water sources, that respected men don't send armed thugs to destroy property, that when someone offers to buy your land and you refuse, the answer should be no thank you, not then I'll destroy you until selling is your only option. You're characterizing normal business competition as, I'm characterizing attempted murder as attempted murder, Mei Lin interrupted, and satisfaction flared through her when the attorney's smooth expression cracked. Mr. Vale's men trapped me in a building rigged to explode. They held a teenage girl hostage and threatened to kill her unless evidence against him was destroyed. Those aren't business practices, they're crimes, and no amount of expensive lawyering changes that. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge had to bang his gavel for order. Eleanor was trying not to smile. The defense attorney was red-faced with fury at losing control of his witness, and Gideon Vale sat stone-faced at his table, finally looking less confident than he had at the start. The rest of the testimony passed in a blur. More questions, more attempts to discredit her, but the damage was done. The jury had heard her speak with conviction instead of uncertainty, had seen her stand up to intimidation instead of crumbling. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but at least she'd fought. When she was finally dismissed, Mei Lin walked back to her seat on shaking legs and let Rhett wrap an arm around her shoulders in silent support. They sat through the rest of the day's testimony, Cole Hendricks confirming Vale's involvement, one of the captured men breaking down and admitting Frank had shown him written orders, a handwriting expert identifying Vale's distinctive signature. By evening, when the judge called adjournment, Eleanor was looking cautiously optimistic. You did well, she told Mei Lin outside the courthouse. Better than well. You connected with the jury, made them see you as a real person instead of just another witness. That matters. Will it be enough? Ask me after the verdict. Eleanor's smile was tired. But if I were betting, I'd say we've got a real chance. Maybe not on the attempted murder charge. That's still hard to prove direct involvement. But on conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of property, witness intimidation? Yeah, I think we've got him. The jury deliberated for 2 days while Mei Lin paced her hotel room and tried not to imagine every possible worst-case scenario. Rhett stayed close, a steady presence that kept her from completely unraveling, and on the 3rd day when word came that a verdict had been reached, he held her hand as they walked back to the courthouse for the final time. The jury foreman was a middle-aged man with a farmer's weathered face and calloused hands. He stood when the judge asked for the verdict, and his voice was steady as he read from the paper in his hands. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom exploded into noise, some cheering, some protesting, everyone having an opinion they needed to share immediately. Mei Lin heard none of it. She was focused on Gideon Vale's face as the guilty verdicts piled up, watching his composure finally crack and reveal the fury beneath. He'd lost. Not completely. The attempted murder acquittal stung, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to face real consequences instead of buying his way out with lawyers and influence. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in territorial prison, forfeiture of property acquired through fraud, and restitution to victims. It wasn't everything Mei Lin had hoped for, but it was justice nonetheless. Real justice, the kind that said even wealthy men had to answer for their crimes. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor shook Mei Lin's hand with genuine warmth. "You helped win this," she said. "Your testimony, your father's journal, your willingness to stand up when standing up looked suicidal. That's what made the difference." So what happens now? Now Vale goes to prison, and his empire gets dismantled piece by piece. The land he acquired through fraud gets returned to original owners or sold at auction. His business interests get investigated for other crimes. And you, Eleanor smiled, you go home and live your life without looking over your shoulder for threats that aren't coming anymore. It sounded too simple to be real, too easy after months of fighting and fear. But walking away from the courthouse with Rhett's hand in hers and the weight of testimony finally lifted from her shoulders, Mei Lin let herself believe it might actually be true. The journey back to Blackthorn Ridge took 3 days because they weren't in a hurry anymore, because the urgency that had driven them had transformed into something gentler. They talked about the future, about combining their ranches officially or keeping them separate, about whether Mei Lin wanted to expand her herd or focus on the cattle she had, about 100 small decisions that added up to building a life together instead of just surviving side by side. "I never thought I'd have this," Mei Lin admitted one night as they sat by their campfire under a sky full of stars. Partnership. Real partnership, where both people matter equally. I thought I'd spend my life alone, fighting alone, dying alone because that's what happened to people like me in places like this. People like you? Rhett's voice was gentle. You mean strong people, stubborn people, people who refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense? I meant foreign people, different people, people the Valley would rather pretend don't exist. She leaned against his shoulder, taking comfort from the solid warmth of him. But maybe you're right. Maybe being different isn't the problem. Maybe the problem was thinking I had to apologize for it instead of just living it. Your father never apologized for being exactly who he was. He built something remarkable without compromising his dignity. Rhett's arm came around her, holding her close. You're doing the same thing, building something that lasts, something that matters, and this time you're not doing it alone. When they finally reached the ranch, they found it transformed again. Someone, probably Marcus and the widow Thompson working together, had planted flowers around the new barn. The fences gleamed with fresh paint. Cattle grazed peacefully in pastures where the grass grew green and thick, watered by the creek that ran clean and strong. It looked like home, like the future her father had dreamed of and fought for, like a place where someone could belong without compromise or apology. Mei Lin stood in the yard where she'd once stood alone and surveyed everything she'd managed to keep, everything she'd almost lost, everything she'd gained by finally learning to stand with someone instead of just standing apart. "Welcome home," Rhett said quietly. And in those 2 words, Mei Lin heard everything that mattered. Acceptance and partnership, respect and love, the promise that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And for the first time since her father died, home felt like more than just a place. It felt like possibility, like hope, like the future opening up instead of closing down, like belonging. The first snow came early that year, dusting the ridge in white 2 weeks after they returned from the territorial capital. Mei Lin woke to silence, that particular quiet that came when snow muffled the world, and found Rhett already awake beside her, watching the dawn light turn the landscape silver. They'd stopped pretending to maintain separate households 3 days after the trial ended. Rhett had simply started staying, and Mei Lin had simply stopped asking him to leave. And somewhere in that unspoken agreement, they'd become something more permanent than either had dared to name yet. "Winter's coming hard," Rhett said quietly, careful not to wake her, though she was already stirring. "We should move your cattle to the lower pastures today, before the snow gets heavy enough to make driving them difficult." "Our cattle?" Mei Lin corrected, propping herself up on one elbow. "You keep saying your ranch and your herd like you're just helping out temporarily. We're past that now, aren't we?" Rhett turned to look at her,
and something vulnerable flickered across his face. Are we? Because I don't want to assume, don't want to take for granted that just because He gestured at the space between them, at the intimacy of waking up together in the house her father built. Just because we're this, that it means I have any claim to what you fought so hard to keep. What if I want you to have a claim? Mei Lin sat up fully, pulling the quilt around her shoulders against the morning chill. What if I'm tired of keeping score about whose land is whose and who owns what? What if I just want to build something together without worrying about who brought more to the partnership? Then I'd say you're describing marriage. Rhett's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held hope he couldn't quite hide. And that's something we should probably discuss when we're both fully awake and thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly right now. Mei Lin reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work, the strength in fingers that could be gentle when they needed to be. I'm thinking that my father spent 15 years building something that almost died with him because he tried to do everything alone. I'm thinking that I almost made the same mistake, and the only reason I didn't is because you were too stubborn to let me. I'm thinking that whatever we build next should be built together from the start, legal and official and without any confusion about who belongs where. Mei Lin Zhao, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing a partnership, an equal partnership, where your ranch and my ranch become our ranch, and neither of us has to wonder if the other person is staying out of obligation or pity or some misplaced sense of duty. She met his eyes. I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is temporary and start building something that lasts. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, and Mei Lin felt her heart hammering with the vulnerability of having laid herself bare. Then he smiled. Not his careful, guarded smile, but something open and undefended that transformed his entire face. Yes, he said simply. To all of it. Partnership, marriage, combining the ranches, building something that lasts. Yes. They were married 3 weeks later in the widow Thompson's parlor, with Marcus Webb standing as witness, and half the valley crammed into a space meant for maybe 20 people. Tom Brennan officiated, his voice still rough with gratitude every time he looked at Mei Lin, and Sarah stood beside her father with tears streaming down her young face. It wasn't the wedding Mei Lin's father might have imagined for her. No traditional Chinese ceremony, no ancestral rituals, no family traveling from across the ocean to witness the union. But it was real, and it was theirs. And when Rhett slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and promised to stand beside her through whatever came next, she felt her father's presence in the room as surely as if he'd been standing there smiling. You may kiss your bride, Tom said, and Rhett did, gentle and reverent and full of promises that would take a lifetime to fulfill. The celebration afterward was modest but genuine. Food the widow had spent days preparing, whiskey Marcus contributed from his carefully hoarded supply, music from Peter's fiddle that got people dancing despite the cramped quarters. Mei Lin found herself pulled into conversation after conversation with people who'd once avoided her, found herself welcomed into a community that had finally decided she belonged. Your father would be proud, the blacksmith's wife said, pressing a wrapped package into Mei Lin's hands. He always said you were stronger than this valley gave you credit for. Guess he was right. Inside the package was a set of brand new smithing tools, hoof picks and rasps and nippers for maintaining horses, practical gifts from someone who understood ranch life and wanted to support it. I can't accept these, Mei Lin started, but the woman cut her off with a firm shake of her head. You can and you will. Consider it an investment in the future. You and Rhett are going to build something important here, and when you do, I want to be able to say I helped instead of standing by watching. Similar gifts came throughout the evening, seeds for spring planting from the feed store, preserved foods from families who'd once refused to sell her supplies, offers of labor and support, and genuine friendship from people who'd learned that community was stronger than prejudice if you gave it the chance. As the party wound down and guests started drifting home through the early winter darkness, Mei Lin stood on the widow's porch beside her new husband and watched the valley settle into night. Strange how fast things can change, she said quietly. 2 months ago I was alone and failing and ready to give up. Now I'm married and surrounded by people who actually care what happens to me. Feels almost unreal. You were never alone, Rhett corrected gently. You just thought you were because you'd convinced yourself that accepting help meant losing yourself. Now you know better.
Now I know I was an idiot who wasted 3 years pushing away the one person trying to help me. You weren't an idiot. You were scared. There's a difference. Rhett pulled her close against the cold. And those 3 years weren't wasted. You needed that time to learn you could stand on your own before you could believe in standing together. If I'd pushed harder earlier, you would have resented it, would have felt trapped instead of chosen. You're being remarkably understanding about me being horrible to you. You weren't horrible. You were honest about your fears, which takes more courage than pretending everything is fine. He kissed the top of her head. Besides, I wasn't exactly perfect either. Watching you for 3 years without your permission, fixing things without asking if you wanted them fixed, that wasn't protection. That was control dressed up in good intentions. We both had to learn how to do this better. They were still standing there when Marcus approached, his expression more serious than it had been during the celebration. "Hate to interrupt," he said, "but there's something you should know. Got word from the territorial capital today. Gideon Vale died in prison last night." The news hit like a physical blow. Mei Lin had spent months wanting Vale punished, had testified against him in court, had celebrated when he was convicted. But death felt different, final in a way that imprisonment wasn't, removing any possibility of redemption or change or eventual reconciliation. "How?" Rhett asked. "Official report says heart attack. Unofficial word is that someone got to him, another inmate with connections to people Vale had ruined over the years." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. "Either way, he's gone, and his will leaves everything to distant relatives back east who've already announced they're selling all his holdings and want nothing to do with the territory." "Everything?" Mei Lin's mind was racing. "Including the properties he acquired through fraud?" "That's the complicated part. His estate is arguing those acquisitions were legitimate business deals and should pass to his heirs. But Eleanor Hastings is fighting back, saying the court forfeiture order takes precedence. Could be tied up in legal battles for years. Or," Rhett said slowly, "we could buy them outright, pool our resources with other ranchers Vale targeted, make offers the estate can't refuse, and get those properties back into the hands of people who'll actually work them instead of hoarding them for speculation." Marcus's eyes lit up. "That's not a bad idea. My water rights were part of what Vale grabbed. If we could recover those, we'd restore what he stole and make sure it doesn't happen again." Mei Lin felt hope stirring, the same stubborn hope that had kept her fighting when fighting seemed pointless. "We'd turn his legacy of greed into something that actually helps the valley." The plan took shape over the following weeks as winter settled in hard and deep. Mei Lin and Rhett reached out to every rancher and farmer who'd lost property to Vale's schemes, proposing a collective purchase funded by pooled resources and managed through a community trust. The response was overwhelming. People who'd spent years nursing grievances suddenly had a chance to reclaim what they'd lost, and they seized it with determination that bordered on desperation. Eleanor Hastings worked her legal magic from the territorial capital, convincing Vale's heirs that a quick sale was better than years of litigation against an entire valley of angry former victims. By spring thaw, the deal was done. Dozens of properties returned to rightful owners, water rights restored, and a new covenant established that prevented any single person from consolidating too much power over essential resources. "Your father would love this," Marcus said one evening as they reviewed the final paperwork in Mei Lin's kitchen. "He always believed community was stronger than individual ambition. This proves it." "He also believed in documentation," Mei Lin added, thinking of the journal that had started everything. "We should record all this properly. Who lost what, how it was returned, what the new agreements say. Future generations should know what happened here." "Future generations," Rhett echoed, and something in his tone made Mei Lin look up sharply. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part hope, part fear, part question he wasn't ready to ask yet. Understanding dawned slowly. Future generations, children. The family they hadn't discussed yet because there were always more immediate crises demanding attention. "Yes," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "Someday, when the ranch is stable and we're not fighting for survival every single day, but yes." The relief on his face was almost comical. "I wasn't sure if we wanted. I know your father never remarried after your mother died, and I thought maybe my father never remarried because he'd had the great love of his life.
and couldn't imagine settling for anything less. But he wanted grandchildren, wanted to see his legacy continue through family, not just property. Mei Lin reached across the table and took Rhett's hand. "We'll have that someday. Just not quite yet." "Someday is good enough for me," Rhett said, and Marcus tactfully excused himself, muttering something about checking on his sons and giving the newlyweds privacy. The years that followed were hard in the way that building anything worthwhile was hard. Endless work, setbacks that tested their resolve, weather that seemed determined to destroy everything they'd planted. But they were hard together instead of hard alone, and that made all the difference. The combined ranch prospered, growing slowly and sustainably rather than through aggressive expansion. They brought in cattle breeds that could handle harsh winters, developed water management systems that prevented the kind of hoarding Vale had practiced, and trained young ranch hands who learned that fair wages and honest work created loyalty that couldn't be bought. Other ranchers noticed. Some followed their example, creating their own partnerships and cooperative agreements. Some resisted, clinging to the old ways of individual competition and zero-sum thinking. But slowly, incrementally, the valley changed. Not into some perfect utopia, prejudice and greed didn't disappear just because one good example existed, but into a place where community had value beyond profit, where helping your neighbor was recognized as strengthening everyone rather than weakening yourself. Mei Lin became known throughout the territory as someone who understood both the practical and the principled aspects of ranching. People sought her advice on everything from breeding stock to water rights disputes. She started teaching, passing on lessons her father had taught her about balancing short-term survival with long-term sustainability, about treating land and animals and people with equal respect. Rhett, for his part, finally escaped the shadow of his father's failures. The Mercer name became associated with integrity instead of shame, with the kind of quiet competence that didn't need to announce itself but was recognized by everyone who paid attention. He served on community boards, mediated disputes, and became the person people turned to when problems needed solving, rather than someone they avoided out of inherited prejudice. 5 years after they married, Mei Lin gave birth to a daughter they named Chen after her grandfather. The baby had Rhett's winter sky eyes and Mei Lin's determined chin, and from the moment she was born, it was clear she'd inherited the stubbornness that had kept both her parents alive when survival seemed impossible. 2 years later came a son they named James after Rhett's mother, whose sacrifice and strength deserved remembering. And 3 years after that, twin girls who arrived screaming their displeasure at the world, and never quite stopped making their opinions known. The house that had once held only Chen Zhao and then only Mei Lin alone expanded to accommodate the chaos of children and partnership and the kind of loud, messy love that couldn't be contained in tidy boundaries. They built additions and made modifications and turned the solitary rancher's dwelling into a home that echoed with laughter and arguments and the daily negotiations of family life. "Your father would have loved this," the widow Thompson said one afternoon, watching the children chase chickens through the yard while Mei Lin prepared dinner and tried not to smile at the chaos. "All this noise and life, this is what he wanted when he brought you here, not just survival, but actual thriving." "I wish he could have seen it," Mei Lin admitted. "Wish he could have known his grandchildren, taught them the things he taught me. Sometimes I still miss him so much it steals my breath." "He sees it," the widow said, with the certainty of someone who'd lost her own spouse and learned to live with absence. "Maybe not in the way we'd prefer, but he knows what you've built, and he's proud." The children grew, each developing their own personality and dreams. Chen, the eldest, showed her grandfather's gift for understanding land and water, for seeing systems and connections others missed. James inherited his grandmother's quiet determination and his father's skill with horses. The twins, Maya and Rose, were wild cards, one drawn to numbers and negotiation, the other to stories and history. All of them learned to work the ranch from the time they could walk, understanding that prosperity came from effort rather than entitlement, that the land would provide if you respected it and worked with it rather than against it. And all of them grew up knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a community their parents had helped build, part of a legacy worth protecting. When Chen turned 16, Mei Lin took her daughter up to the ridge where Rhett had once watched in secret, protecting without permission. They stood together looking down at the valley spread below, the ranch that had nearly been lost but had survived, the community that had finally learned to value cooperation over competition,
the future that continued unfolding despite all the forces that had tried to prevent it. Your grandfather built this ranch knowing he might not live to see it succeed, Mei Lin told her daughter. He did it anyway because he believed in creating something that would outlast him, because he understood that legacy isn't about personal glory, but about making the world a little better for the people who come after. Is that what you and Papa did? Chen asked. Made things better? We tried. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we failed, but we kept trying. Mei Lin wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders. And now it's your generation's turn. You and James and the twins, you'll face different challenges than we did, but the principles stay the same. Work hard, treat people fairly, stand up for what's right even when it costs you, and remember that community is stronger than individual ambition. That's a lot of pressure, Chen said, but she was smiling. It's a lot of opportunity. Big difference. Mei Lin smiled back. You don't have to do it alone. That's the other lesson your grandfather taught me, though it took me years to learn it. You don't have to carry everything yourself. You build partnerships, create networks of support, trust that other people want to help if you let them. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun descended toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Below them, the ranch carried on its daily rhythms, cattle moving between pastures, horses grazing near the barn, the creek running clean and strong, just as Chen Zhao had fought to ensure it would. It wasn't perfect. There were still people in the valley who looked at Mei Lin's mixed heritage children and saw difference before they saw anything else. There were still ranchers who believed competition was better than cooperation, who hoarded resources and exploited workers and thought only of short-term profit. There were still injustices that needed fighting and prejudices that needed challenging. But there was also hope, real hope, the kind built on tangible evidence that change was possible, that good people could win sometimes if they refused to quit, that standing up to power wasn't always suicide. Sometimes it was just the beginning of transformation. 10 years passed, then 20. The children grew and made their own choices, Chen taking over primary management of the ranch with a vision that honored tradition while embracing innovation, James starting a horse breeding program that became renowned across 3 territories, the twins pursuing educations back east before returning with new ideas about sustainable land management and cooperative economics. Rhett's hair went gray, then white, though he remained strong enough to work cattle and mend fences well into his 60s. Mei Lin developed the same weathered look her father had carried, skin marked by years of sun and wind, hands scarred from decades of hard work, but eyes still sharp and determined. They became the valley's elders, the ones people turned to for wisdom and mediation and stories about how things used to be. They watched their grandchildren grow up in a territory that had slowly, painfully, learned to value people for their character rather than their ancestry. It wasn't universal, prejudice never fully died, but it was better than it had been, and better was worth celebrating. On a spring morning 40 years after they'd married, Mei Lin and Rhett rode together up to the ridge one final time. Age had slowed them both, made the climb harder than it once was, but some rituals deserved maintaining regardless of difficulty. I never told you this, Rhett said as they sat side by side watching the valley wake up, but I almost gave up. That night, after you told me to leave forever, after the barn burned and you thought I'd done it, I came so close to just leaving, selling my place, moving to some new territory where nobody knew the Mercer name, and I could start fresh without all the baggage. What stopped you? Mei Lin asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. I realized running away didn't change anything, that I'd just carry the same fears and the same patterns to some new place and make the same mistakes all over again. Rhett's hand found hers, fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of 40 years together, staying and fighting for what mattered, even when it seemed hopeless. That was the only way to actually change, to become someone worth being. You were always worth being, Mei Lin said gently. You just needed to believe it yourself. Same could be said about you. You spent years thinking you had to prove you deserved to be here, had to earn the right to take up space in this valley. But you belonged all along. Your father knew it. I knew it. Took you longer to figure it out, but you got there eventually. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air and bringing the world to life around them. Below, the ranch bustled with activity. their children and grandchildren carrying on the work, building on foundations that had been laid in blood and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that power always won. "We did something good here," Mei Lin said finally.
Didn't we? We took something broken and made it work. Took a valley that ran on fear and greed and showed it there was another way.
"We did something good," Rhett agreed. "Not perfect, not complete, but good. And the next generation will do even better because they're starting from a stronger foundation than we had. I wish my father could have seen all this, could have known what became of the ranch he built and the daughter he raised."
He sees it, Rhett said with certainty that echoed the widow Thompson's words from decades earlier.
"Maybe not how we'd choose, but he knows. And he's proud of what you've built, what we've built together." Mei Lin leaned against her husband's shoulder and let herself feel the weight of 40 years, the struggles and victories, the losses and gains, the moments of despair and the moments of transcendent joy. It had been hard. It had been brutal. There were scars that would never fully heal and losses that could never be recovered. But there was also this, partnership that had endured, community that had grown stronger, legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Children who knew their worth without having to prove it constantly. Grandchildren who grew up in a valley that had learned to value cooperation over domination. A future that looked brighter than the past, built on foundations they'd helped lay. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Always striving toward better. As they rode back down to the ranch where their family waited, where work demanded attention, and life continued its relentless forward march, Mei Lin thought about the girl she'd been, alone and afraid, and certain that survival meant never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. That girl had been wrong about so many things. Wrong about strength, meaning isolation. Wrong about help, meaning weakness. Wrong about love requiring surrender. The woman she'd become understood that real strength was asking for help when you needed it, that partnership could exist between equals, that loving someone didn't mean losing yourself if you chose the right person to love. She'd learned those lessons the hard way, through fire and fear and near destruction. But she'd learned them. And in learning them, she'd transformed not just herself, but the entire valley around her. That was the legacy worth leaving, not just land and cattle and material success, but the understanding that change was possible, that justice could win sometimes, that good people standing together were stronger than powerful people standing alone. The story that had started with a barn burning and a desperate woman accusing the wrong man had become something larger than either of them. It had become proof that redemption was real, that second chances mattered, that the future didn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past if people were willing to learn and change and fight for better. Mei Lin Zhao had come to Blackthorn Ridge as Chen's daughter, defined by her father's legacy and her own foreignness. She'd survived as a woman alone, nearly broken by the weight of standing isolated against overwhelming force. But she'd triumphed as Rhett Mercer's partner, as mother to children who carried both their strengths, as the elder who'd shown an entire valley. That community was stronger than competition, that cooperation created prosperity that selfishness never could. And when the time came for her own story to end, years later, surrounded by family, and the house her father built and she'd expanded, her last thought was of gratitude. Gratitude for the father who'd given her the foundation. Gratitude for the husband who'd taught her that accepting help wasn't surrender. Gratitude for the community that had finally learned to embrace rather than exclude. Gratitude for the life she'd fought for and the legacy she was leaving behind. The ranch continued, the children prospered, the valley grew and changed, facing new challenges with the lessons learned from old battles. And in the quiet moments when the wind blew across the ridge and the creek ran clean and strong through land that had been fought for and defended and finally secured, there were those who swore they could still feel Chen Zhao's approval and Mei Lin's determination and Rhett's steadfast loyalty, not as ghosts, not as haunting, but as presence, the kind that came from lives lived with purpose, from battles fought for principle, from love that transformed not just individuals but entire communities. The cowboy who everyone desired had won the woman everyone doubted by refusing to abandon her when abandonment would have been easier. And the woman who everyone underestimated had won her place in history by refusing to quit when quitting would have been justified. Together, they'd rewritten what was possible in a frontier that had believed itself unchangeable. Together, they'd proved that justice could triumph over power if people were stubborn enough to keep fighting. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both. Not just a ranch or a family, but a vision of what community could become when it chose cooperation over competition, when it valued character over appearance, when it remembered that the strongest things in the world weren't built by individuals standing alone, but by partnerships standing together. That was the story of Blackthorn Ridge. That was the legacy of Mei Lin Zhao and Rhett Mercer. That was what happened when good people refused to accept that might made right. When stubborn love proved stronger than systematic oppression, when community finally remembered that everyone's success was connected. Not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale where every problem was solved and every injustice erased, but a real ending where the arc bent slowly toward justice because people were willing to push it, where tomorrow looked brighter than yesterday because today's choices had been made with tomorrow in mind. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered. The frontier that had tried to break them had been transformed by their refusal to break. The valley that had rejected Mei Lin had been reshaped by her insistence on belonging. The legacy that had nearly died with Chen Zhao had been secured by his daughter's determination and her partner's devotion. The story was complete. The circle was closed. And the future, the beautiful, uncertain, promising future, belonged to the next generation to shape and define and defend, just as it should be.